Montserrat. Take charge of everything and let all be done according to your will and your way. In Jesus' name, amen.
I seek your cooperation in asking everyone to kindly place their phones on silent. Thank you in advance, and of course, those who are wishing to join us, they may follow us live on ZJB Radio and on YouTube. I wish to acknowledge the Honorable Speaker of the Legislative Assembly and all the members of the Legislative Assembly joining us in person or online. I would also wish to acknowledge our witnesses and their organizations this morning. I would also like to acknowledge our audience both in person and virtually. I also wish to acknowledge and record our thanks to the Secretariat, which is manned by Mrs. Dr. Judith Baker and the members of her staff. And we extend special welcome to our clerk from the Commonwealth Association. This morning, we are continuing our Access Committee special hearings. The committee, as I said before in previous occasions, was established by a resolution of the Montserrat Legislative Assembly to examine and report on access matters, and in particular, issues of access by air, by sea, including ferry service, cargo, docking during rough seas, relevant regulations regarding airport facility, aircraft types, and access in general, and the improvement of access to and from Montserrat, informed by access policy. The committee and its members are bound by due confidentiality, but shall have a duty to report to the Assembly and the public on findings, analysis, recommendations. The findings and recommendations will be submitted and debated by the Legislative Assembly. The committee consists of 3 members, including the chairman, appointed from among the members of the Legislative Assembly. It is hereby sitting today Mr. Donson Romeo, honorary member of the opposition, Ms. Jamel Greenaway, Parliamentary Counsel of the Legislative Assembly, Mrs. Veronica Dorset, Hector yours truly, Parliamentary Secretary and Chair, and Dr. Judith Baker, Clerk of the Assembly. The committee seeks to examine the areas highlighted in the resolution of the Assembly, and since its inception, the committee continues to hold meetings, request, and continue to review documents surrounding access legislation governing air and sea access, the Sustainable Development Plan, and also Sea and Air Access Updated Strategy. It embarked on public information gathering exercises. As part of this exercise, it held a town hall meeting right here at the Braids Arts and Education Center in March. The meeting was carried live on Radio Montserrat and streamed live as well. It was followed by a radio program that was held on the radio. It was participated in by the public, who shared their issues and their concerns and solutions. Members of the public were encouraged to participate further and encouraged to submit information via email, telephone. Some persons have used these mediums, and we are thankful. The committee has also met with a number of groups in the community, to include the Salem Community Development Group. This was a hybrid meeting, in person and online. The Lookout Community Group, the Rotary Group, the primary schools, Youth Parliament, the Haitian Committee. We wanted to revisit some groups, but time did not permit. We are still receiving information and evidence if you wish to share your concerns, your issues, and suggestions. The committee has agreed that evidence sessions also will be part of the inquiry, and this will be held in public. And during the course of this inquiry, both written and oral evidence would be taken. The committee formal inquiry began with the manager and members of the staff of the John A. Osborne Airport on the 27th of July, 2023. It was deeply regrettable that due to administrative hiccups, we were unable to broadcast the proceedings. However, the transcripts will form a part of the report. It was also forced to abort further public sessions of inquiry due to unforeseen developments, and we sincerely apologize to those witnesses who were scheduled. Today, we continue this inquiry, as I've said, and we will hear from several witnesses. We can assure the public that we're eager to complete this task and have indicated to Parliament some of the challenges confronting the committee. We are today going to continue, and so to all our witnesses and your organization, we wish to record our thanks for your cooperation and also for rearranging your schedules to accommodate these hearings. I will now proceed to housekeeping rules. These proceedings are recorded and forms part of the transcripts and the records of report. As I said before, they are being broadcasted. You are therefore asked to speak clearly. The committee will not only receive your evidence, but will ask questions and may ask or invite witnesses to clarify questions if necessary. Witnesses may advance their suggestions or solutions and the recommendations. We are not here to answer questions. However, if there's a question you wish to ask, we will record this and seek an answer where it advances the work and the purpose of this committee. Witnesses and their organizations may be asked to provide documentation or further information to assist the work of the committee. Witnesses may refer to their legal attorney for advice or their institutions on answering questions. The committee reserves the right to recall witnesses and request further information in its various forms. Thank you very much, and we will now proceed to call in our first witness for this morning's proceedings. And that is Captain Nigel Harris and Mrs. Harris will also join Captain Harris. And I may say from the outset that questions will come from all members of the committee. Okay?
Thank you very much, and good morning to the committee, and good morning to
Your mic is not on.
Press the red button, and that will put your mic on.
Sorry about that, technology. So I'd just like to say thank you for being invited, and good morning to the committee, and good morning to everyone listening in. I would also add it's rather disappointing at the attendance here today. I thought people would have had far more interest in access.
Yes, I think they do, but most of them probably at work, and they're also listening online, hence. So thank you, Captain Harris and Mrs. Harris, am I correct in saying that? For attending our proceedings this morning. I would first ask you to give us a detailed history of flying Montserrat.
Oh, I can do that. In a slightly different form. We originally set up here in the late 1980s and operated 3 islanders, the same as today. And that continued until, unfortunately, 1996, 1995, we all know what happened with the volcano. And we had no airport, no air service. So we retreated back to the United Kingdom, and then we came out again around 2007. We were involved with Halcrow and the British government on looking for appropriate sites. I personally was involved in some of the tests that took place, particularly in respect of turbulence and winds. And subsequent to that, we actually set up shop again with our 3 islanders, Fly Montserrat, which I'm sure you know. And we've been operating here since then. We consider ourselves very much part of the infrastructure of Montserrat. Air ambulance flights are really important given the limitations of our hospital. For example, last Friday I personally did an air ambulance flight to Trinidad, which is a bit unusual and hopefully saved a life. So we're very much part of that. We have a stretcher fit to our aircraft, as you know. And Other things that we do for Montserrat particularly are we have dangerous goods approval, which may not sound of interest, but if you want vaccine here like COVID, you have to have dangerous goods approval. So we have that, so we're quite specialist on carrying dangerous goods. And uniquely in the region, we actually have approval to go to islands that other operators can't. And in that, I would include the French islands, Guadeloupe, St. Bart's, etc. And also the Dutch islands, St. Martin, where you require, if you're going into these islands, you require European approval because they are still part of the EU in the case of Guadeloupe. So we're here, we have 3 islanders. We operate every day, usually about 3 rotations to the hub in Antigua. We operate charter from Venezuela up to Turks and Caicos, even though some of those are a bit of a long way in an islander. And we sleep here, all 3 aircraft sleep on island, which is really essential. If you're not based on island, it's very difficult to actually operate. As we all know, the main hub is Antigua, and flights arrive in Antigua from about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and time they've all gone through the zoo of Antigua, of customs, immigration, etc. It's quite difficult to get people here in the window, 4 o'clock to 15 minutes after dark. So what would actually make us more efficient here? First of all, we and our competitors, including Winair, are operating geriatric aircraft. We're operating Islanders, we're operating Twin Otter 300s, and they were all born in the 1980s, which poses the question, would you go out and buy a 1980s car? Probably not. So the technology is old technology, and they're expensive to maintain, and it is very, very difficult to source parts. Our manufacturer, Britten-Norman, is going through financial difficulties, which means they're not paying their suppliers, which means it's almost impossible to get parts. Amongst our competitors, one has had an aircraft on the ground for 2 years waiting for parts, and another one still has an aircraft after a year. So what's going to help us? First of all, we need to upgrade our fleet. We need to get modern 2020 technology aircraft. That's really important. We need fuel in Montserrat. We get our fuel mainly at the moment in Antigua, and their Bowsers break down with incredible regularity. They have 3 Bowsers, and several times in the last few months, all 3 have been broken. No fuel equals no service. You can't fly without fuel. So we need a Bowser at Montserrat. What else do we need? We need a hangar. Currently, we do our line maintenance at Montserrat, but we do our base maintenance at Anguilla, which is inconvenient and expensive. So we need a hangar at Montserrat, and we have been trying with government to get all these things done for many, many years. We have made many, many proposals to government on how we move forward, how we upgrade our service. Normally, we don't get a response. It's left in a filing tray somewhere, which is disappointing. We believe, but we're not sure, that the government of Montserrat are shareholders in Fly Montserrat. So we would hope that if they are shareholders, that they actually support their local airline. I can tell you that if you start off...
May I just interrupt? Can you tell us, therefore, about your legal structure, since you're talking about shareholders?
Okay, we are a private company, limited by shares. Most of our shareholders are local people, which was the intention. We have about 30 minority local shareholders. I'm a majority shareholder, and we believe also is the government of Montserrat. The reason I say believe is that the shares are held by the Montserrat Development Corporation. I have done a company search at Financial Services. They haven't filed accounts since 2013. There are no registered directors. In most countries we operate, they'd have been struck off by now. So I don't actually know the status of the government shareholding. But the answer to your question is we're a private company responsible to our shareholders.
Okay, thank you. You may continue.
Thank you very much indeed. So yes, we are definitely looking to some sort of joint public-private sector arrangement, which I think is the way forward for Montserrat. What I was about to say was, if you go as far north as Florida, follow the island chain down to Venezuela, just about every airline is owned and highly, highly financed by government. Air Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, wherever, they are very much owned and supported. Now, that's fairly unique in the world. That was the situation 50 years ago. Most places, Europe, America, the airlines that were owned by government are now in the private sector. Uniquely in the Caribbean, they remain mainly in the public sector. So that as it may be, the way forward we see is some form of private-public arrangement. Let's start off first, before we look at anything. Since we've been here back in the 1980s, I've never, ever seen a government policy on access. So I welcome what you guys are doing here at the moment. As a private sector company, it is impossible for us to invest significant sums where we don't know what the policy is. I don't know if there's going to be a ferry next week. I don't know if there's going to be another airline with twin otters. How are we expected to put the resources in place to meet demand? Now, demand is what I call the market. What is the market? Well, we all know how many people live on Montserrat. Our statistics department are very, very good at producing statistics on visitor arrivals. My good wife is the expert on statistics, but in ballpark terms, there are about 20,000 passenger movements a year. And that's been static for a long time, post the volcano, and of course, COVID, it went totally down. But we're almost sort of back to pre-COVID numbers, and it's about 20,000. So we all understand that's 10,000 in, 10,000 out, okay? We treat the sector as one. Right, okay.
20,000 what?
20,000 passengers. I'll let my wife have a go.
Yeah,
okay, my wife is the expert on detail. But basically the market is around about 20,000.
The passenger figures up till 2019, which is the last year that we have, shall we say, a full set of people coming on island, were about 20,500 each way. So 40,000 passenger movements. And there's been some sort of trends. All these figures come from the statistics department, so you can get your data direct from them, and I always think that decisions should be data-led. But what has been clear over the last 5 years up till 2019 was that December passenger numbers are falling. People aren't coming for Christmas so much now. They're either moving to either different times of the year, but the numbers have been reducing for the December break. So December figures up until 2019 had dropped down to about 4,300 passengers both ways, and both air and sea in 2019. Sea has about, the ferry that is, has about 65% of the market when there is a ferry operating. So if the ferry is operating, say, this Christmas with reduced figures, if you look at the figures for this year, we're probably, I mean, we're 9 months into the year already, we're probably going to get about 12,000 each way for the year by the time we get to the end of December. So we're way under, well, just over half of what we were in 2019. Okay. So much, much reduced, even with good numbers this Christmas.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Shelley. She's far better at numbers than I am.
I don't know if I should intervene here or should I allow you to finish?
No, I have a question. I'm still going. Still going. Right, so thank you very much for that.
I wanted to ask a question about the figures you just quoted. What percentage, what exact figure do you have for the numbers of passengers traveling since the ferry is not in service by year?
So the ferry
per
has,
year.
Right, the ferry has made a significant difference to the market and to obviously the air share of the market. So as soon as there is a ferry, our numbers reduce significantly, not necessarily because people want to go on the ferry, but because of the cost of the ferry. Traditionally, it has been highly subsidised at times when we've not had a subsidy at all. So people would move to the ferry simply on cost. The only time that there has been a subsidy for both ferry and air at the same time, and therefore people have a genuine choice, if you like, a fair choice with a level playing field, was in 2016 when there was no ferry from April through to December 2016. And in December, when the ferry came back, for 6 weeks, there was a subsidy for both us and the ferry, and our numbers maintained enough for us to be profitable. When there is just a subsidy, a highly subsidised ferry in competition to us, we've lost 65% of the market and we become uneconomic, and you're going to end up with no airline here because it's not sustainable.
I have many questions. I think I'll save them till Ms. Harris is finished.
Okay.
So looking to the future, which is what I think we're trying to do. So we start with the market, which Shelly has given a very detailed number on. So that's the market we've got. We are a private company, so therefore we're responsible for turning a profit on the company, which is what private sector companies do. So our resources are aircraft, which I've touched on. We have old aircraft and we want new aircraft.
Okay,
They're more economical, and we have done, I'm aware that the Governor has her own consultant dealing with this, but we've done our own assessment clearly, and effectively and commercially there are only 3 aircraft that can come into our runway, and I'll talk about performance in a moment, if I may. So the 3 aircraft are a Twin Otter 400, but with a limited payload, an aircraft called a Technam, which is what people are buying at the moment, brand new modern aircraft that will operate with 11 passengers, not with 18, but will operate with twice the weight that we carry in an Islander, so bags shouldn't be left behind. And there is a third one, which of course is an Islander, and they haven't been made for many, many years, but this year there will be a limited number made, according to the manufacturer.
If you'll just allow me. Since we're on the aircraft, the Island is what you manage?
Sorry?
What you fly?
We fly 3 Islanders, yes.
All right. So can you describe the aircraft for the benefit of the community?
Sure. They're a twin-engined Islander aircraft, and as the name would imply, they are designed all over the world to fly between islands. Short hops, it's not the most comfortable of airplane, but up to 30, 45 minutes. Short hops onto very short runways, which is why it's a STOL being short takeoff and landing aircraft. So the Islander is what we're operating at the moment.
What's the cabin volume?
The volume will carry 9 passengers plus the pilot, but as we all know, Caribbean people travel with lots of bags, and we have restrictions on runway length, which I'll come to in a moment. So effectively, we fly with 7, occasionally 6, depending on the weight. But the maximum figure for planning purposes would be 7.
Okay. And so your baggage capacity is what?
If 7 people turn up with a standard 50-pound bag, that's it.
That's it.
Yeah, and a small carry-on.
Okay. And what is the normal lifespan for an Islander?
I can't answer that. As long as we can obtain spares and keep it going. I mean, theoretically, forever. But the cost would be absolutely astronomical.
Okay. What is the age of your current Islanders operating?
1980s.
1980s.
So if I may,
I'll allow you to continue, and then...
Can I just finish the performance bit, because I think it impinges on what you're saying. There are lots of figures, numbers, and almost rubbish talked about performance at our airport. I spent 3 months full-time on a university course just on performance. It is very, very complex, but I'll try and simplify it, because the performance dictates the aircraft we can have, which dictates the number of seats, and therefore, dovetails into what you're trying to achieve. So the new airport, if I may call it that, at Gerrards, we have 600 metres of tarmac. So there is physically 600 metres. So when I go on and talk about the runway being shortened, please, I'm not talking about excavators and men with shovels. They're not digging it up. There's still 600 metres of runway. But it means for our calculations, we cannot use all of it. And this is where the problems start. So you reduce the effective length due to lots of factors. The aircraft has a structural weight, in the case of an Islander, 6,600 pounds. So that's the absolute maximum that we can operate. But it also has a runway limitation, that is the size of the runway, is it uphill, is it grass or is it concrete, etc. And then there's a third consideration, which is temperature. And as we all know, temperatures here recently have been around 31 degrees, occasionally 32. The limiting factor for any aircraft coming to Montserrat is going to be what we call WAT, which is essentially temperature and density. The airport is 510 feet above sea level, and you have to work on an average temperature of 29, 30 degrees. That is the limiting factor of any aircraft coming to Montserrat, will be the WAT limitation. So it's important that we understand that. In our case, we have fixed pitch propellers, so we land, we brake, we stop. The maximum runway we need, all up weight, is approximately 400 metres. So as I've said, we have 600, we need 400. Islander has no problem at all, subject to its WAT limit. However, if aircraft are coming in with variable pitch propellers, such as a Twin Otter, under international rules, and it's not ASI and it's not ECA, international rules, you cannot take into consideration that reverse thrust for landing on your performance calculations. Simply why? Because there's no way of testing it in the air. You don't know until you get on the ground whether it's going to work, and that is not safe and it's not acceptable internationally. So you cannot include that calculation. So the Twin Otter has to operate the same way as an Islander without the use of reverse thrust. Of course, it can use it in practice, but it can't have it in the calculation, which means they are restricted to 9, 10 seats. I mean, that's up to them to tell you, but it's a lesser load. So Twin Otters is all we hear on the radio. We need Twin Otters, we need Twin Otters. I would suggest that you might want to think about that. Also, the Twin Otter 300, which is the old aircraft, again is having problems with spares, as you'd expect, since the 1980s. But there is a new variant called a Twin Otter 400. I wish we could change the name to distinguish it differentiate it from the 300. But the 400 is a much better aircraft. As far as I know, the only operator of the 400 in the Caribbean was an airline out of Martinique. And unfortunately, they had an accident in St. Bart's a few weeks ago. So I don't think there are any 400s at the moment. I stand to be corrected, but I don't think so. So a Dash 400 is definitely viable.
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
What, the bit about the aircraft had a crash? Yes, it was operated by an operator out of Martinique, I believe. And it was, I think, written off in St. Bart's on landing 2-3 weeks ago. So I don't think there are any 400s in the region. So we're looking at replacing our aircraft, and by far the best that suits the market. I have to keep coming back to the market, because if we're flying with empty seats, that means we go bust. So we have to have a market. Is the Tecnam STOL aircraft, a modern aircraft. A company up in Puerto Rico have just ordered 130 of these aircraft. So it's going to be very popular. It'll be replacing Islanders within 5 years. And it's called the Tecnam, if you missed that. So in terms of the, sorry?
It's called the what?
Tecnam, T-E-C-N-A-M. It's Italian. Comes from Italy. So the other factors we have to look at is our runway, which is shrinking, as I say, not physically. So we have research about which a lot of nonsense has been talked, but basically it shortens the runway back to 530 metres. But there is another problem that comes up recently. I mean, Yes.
Does the research in any way impact your airline?
No, because we only need 400 meters. So reducing it to 530 doesn't, but it does for other aircraft like a Twin Otter. That's, okay. Right, so the regulators, the international regulator is ICAO, but ICAO only makes recommendations. It doesn't make laws. It's up to each individual state to make their own laws. And we're regulated by the UK Civil Aviation Authority through their agency called ASI, which you hear a lot about. So ASI are only adopting what ICAO has made as a recommendation. You would, as a state, be very unwise not to follow ICAO, because essentially, if you don't, the Americans would say, we're not flying our aeroplanes into your state and your aircraft can't come to ours, and the whole system falls apart. So basically, what ICAO recommends as a minima, people like the UK CAA and the American FAA will follow. Now, having had the runway reduced by RESA, we are looking at another problem now. They have just changed the rules recently on how you treat wet and damp and contaminated runways. So I was 2 days ago talking to operators of Islanders and Twin Otters in the UK, and because the runway may be reported wet, and we do get rain here, I know we don't get snow and ice, but we certainly get rain, Twin Otters in Europe are being forced to put their passengers on Islanders because the Twin Otter doesn't meet the dampness criteria. This is a very complex subject, and I don't want to confuse everybody, but it's something we need to be aware of. There's yet another impediment in using Twin Otters or bigger aircraft because it will restrict the weight. And in fact, when you have the runway reported as wet in Europe at the moment, the Twin Otter cannot operate onto those runways. We're talking about short runways, not obviously runways 2 miles long, which is not a problem. But it's short runways are the problem. So there are all sorts of issues about what aircraft we operate. So to sort of summarize where we are as a company, we would like to work close, just if I may just finish, we would like to get closer to government. We want government to have a very clearly published policy so that we have the warm and cuddly feelings will let us invest in our airline. At the moment, we can't invest because we don't know what's coming to meet us next week, and that's totally unacceptable. But we see a joint venture with government, which in Europe and in America they call a PSO. I like to familiarize you with that. A PSO is a public service obligation route, where it's clearly defined what the fares are, what the schedules are, and government is hands-on active, as they are with the ferry. We would like to see that arrangement, similar to what happens in a ferry, with the aircraft, that they work on a public service obligation.
Mr. Harris, I have many questions. You've touched on far more than I expected in your introduction. However, I want to ask your wife a question regarding the numbers, ferry numbers, since the ferry has been aborted. What are your numbers since 2019?
I haven't got, I don't think, the numbers to hand off the top of my head. Obviously, the ferry stopped right when COVID began. So during COVID, we were down to, I think, 7,000 passengers a year in 2020, I think. And that everybody was obviously coming by air.
Would it be more than 15,000 in the past year?
In this coming year?
Yeah.
Well, my projection for the year is that we're going to have 24,000 by the end of December for the whole year. But most of those either came in March or will come in December.
Really? Question, how does that affect your profitability now, with or without subsidies?
While Air is carrying the whole market,
correct,
although split between us and SVG, we are profitable at the moment. As soon as there is a ferry, which is highly subsidized.
No, I'm not getting at that yet. We realize the difference. Yeah. So you're saying at present? At
present, we are holding our own because with the subsidy that obviously benefits the passenger, not ourselves, because that goes straight to the passenger.
Do you think you can handle 30,000 at this time?
30,000 a year?
Yes.
Yes.
You can.
If we had notice.
Yeah, we
If-
can't, we have to gear up for it.
With the airlines you have presently, can you handle 30,000?
Yes, if we're given notice. We need a 6-month lead-in to train crews, obtain aircraft. So a minimum of 6 months.
I'm simply getting at the fact that I have difficulty getting a ticket out of here for both airlines very often and getting back, unlike before.
Can I say something
Yes.
on that? I mean, we heard something about last week saying people were stuck in Antigua for 2 days.
Okay.
Nobody rang us and asked for a flight.
And our
So,
airplanes were
you know,
flying half empty.
we run a wait list where anybody can put themselves down and say, I want a flight for X, it's showing full at the moment, let us know if you can put on another flight. We only need another 5 people to be able to put on an extra flight, subject to our availability, obviously. But the wait list during September has been 2 people, I think, on one day. So there's a lot of misinformation around.
So you're saying you can handle 30,000?
Yes, I mean, spread throughout
Comfortably.
a month. Not all in one afternoon.
No, of course not. Of course not. This is a serious question. Okay, can you tell us what the subsidies have been like since the ferry has left?
Yeah, variable. So I think, I'm just trying to remember. I think the subsidy was about 100 EC dollars per passenger flown last year. It's now 170, which benefits the passenger because they pay less for their ticket. So that's 170 at the moment. But I thought Cabinet had agreed a subsidy from January, but it didn't come in until May. So I don't know what happened to the subsidy for passengers during that time. There was nothing at all, so no help to the passengers at all.
Did you request the subsidy?
Well, we asked for it, not for us, because we don't benefit from it. It's the passenger that benefits from it because it reduces the fare by the amount of the subsidy. So we were asking on behalf of our passengers, because I thought that there was budget for it, but there was nothing forthcoming and no real explanation as to what was coming in. Not only that, when it did come in, we were given 24 hours notice. So anybody wanting to book ahead couldn't benefit from the subsidy. And we now have a situation where the subsidy at 170 EC dollars is only till 31st of October. So people coming, wanting to fly in November, December, and wanting to book now aren't going to benefit from that.
And is there a breakdown in your relationship with government? What's the reason for this?
We don't have very many meetings at all. I mean, if you go back to when there was no ferry in 2016, there were weekly meetings with us, with DFID. The Premier came to a lot of them, and DFID with a SBG attended every week, like the milk. We had a meeting in which there was a complete open debate, if you like, about how we could improve things during the period that there was no ferry.
Therefore, with or without subsidies, you're profitable at this present time,
We're holding our own, yes.
along with...
But I am also worried that come December, we're about to have the rug pulled from under our feet, because I understand that there has been a ferry tender, which might mean that there is a subsidy for the ferry, and that would be completely unfair. I mean, there is legislation in the UK on fair competition, which it wouldn't be allowed to have that unfair competition with a ferry that is operated by a government putting a subsidy in place that is just for their passengers, not for every passenger. And a local company, air passengers are disadvantaged. It's the air passengers that are going to be hard done by. And in the UK, with UK money being used to give the access budget, There's legislation there that says this can't happen. I'm very concerned.
Okay. Earlier, Mr. Harris, you said that the carrying capacity of the aircraft, apart from passengers, includes one bag at 50, what weight?
50 pounds.
50 pounds along with a handbag.
Yeah.
Can the aircraft carry a full load of passengers with their 50-pound bag and handbag?
It's a theoretical question. Theoretically, yes. But if those passengers are over 300 pounds, no.
I see. And what do you do in that circumstance?
If they're over 300 pounds, we ask them to buy another seat. But unfortunately, on the computer, when people make computer reservations, some of them lie. And they'll put their weight down as 220. When we weigh them, they're 320. Our competitors have a lower threshold than we do. I mean, it's quite common now for small airlines to put a weight penalty on. So the answer to your question is, yes, in practice, probably, but we couldn't promise it.
Did you say that if someone is over 300 pounds, probably way over, they pay how much?
They buy an extra seat.
They buy an extra seat. So at one point, I'm told of a passenger who was well over 300, and he paid $2,000.
I can't
nearly
comment
$1,000 to go to Antigua for more than a day.
Okay. I think that might be Montserrat folklore, but if you want to give me his name, I can look into it.
At one point, you paid in excess of $800-900 returned from Antigua, including the airport tax. Therefore, if you're paying for 2 seats, it will be well over $1,500, $1,600, nearly $2,000.
Can I come in now?
Yes, yes.
I mean, I don't know the circumstance that you're talking about, unless he was chartering, perhaps,
okay.
or
no.
what? I don't know.
Okay, wonderful. You want to? Go ahead. Who regulates the airfare?
Nobody. We do. We set our airfare. If you're going to regulate airfares, you're then a PSO with everything that goes with a PSO, public service obligation.
Does the government influence the airfare in negotiating, providing
Not at all.
a subsidy?
No.
So you set your airfare and the government subsidizes?
Yeah, we take our costs, add a reasonable profit, and that's our airfare.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anybody else has another question on that matter. You mentioned, go ahead.
Since we're dealing with costs, can you please explain for us, Flying Montserrat, costing or pricing structure? That would probably help us to understand.
Simple answer is no. That is commercially sensitive. We're not going to tell you our cost basis. But we take our costs, and as you'd expect, fuel costs have gone through the roof in the last 2 years. Insurance costs have gone up because maintenance costs have gone up. Therefore, the cost of repairing an aircraft is going to be higher. Our costs are absolutely astronomical. There is a world shortage of qualified, experienced pilots. There is a world shortage of qualified, experienced engineers. So we have to work with market forces and pay what the market dictates. But in terms of giving you individual costings, no, that's commercially sensitive. And I'm sure my good friend, Mr. Gravel, would love to know what we're...
Do your shareholders know the price structure?
Nope.
Okay.
But they see our accounts, of course. Our shareholders get our accounts, audited accounts, so that they know what our costs are in total.
Can I just add something there? I just want to check whether the Honourable Dr. Hector meant costs as in the costs of operating or the cost to the passenger of a ticket.
Sorry.
During our information gathering,
Sure. I mean, ticket.
one of the issues, the cost of the ticket.
Ticket costs are very easy to just go onto the internet, go onto our website, you can see all what our ticket prices are. So there's no secret about ticket prices. Sorry, I misunderstood your question. I thought you were talking our cost to operate.
Yes, we are talking about what comprises, what brings the cost so high. Because persons are saying it's a 15-minute ride from Antigua to Montserrat and I must pay this amount. Like you said, you don't need a subsidy for yourself. It's really your passengers that you're seeking to help. So because of that issue arose across the board when we visited the organizations and even in our public discussions, hence why the committee is seeking to get an understanding of what factors would impact your costs.
Okay, I can take that one. We talked about fuel, which is now up around $12 a gallon from, I can remember buying fuel out in the Caribbean a year ago at about $6. So fuel costs have gone through the roof. Maintenance costs have gone through the roof. We've already said that Britain Norman and de Havilland with the Twin Otter are finding difficulties in getting suppliers, and therefore the costs are going up as spares. So spares are very expensive. Just two recent examples of why costs are expensive. We fly from an airport, we go to an airport. If I'm flying from London to Antigua, it's the same. My costs at London and my costs are at Antigua are the same as if I fly to Montserrat. My costs are at Montserrat, my costs are at Antigua. So the bit in between, yes, we're burning fuel and maintenance, but the big costs are the airport. I mentioned we did a medevac to Trinidad last Friday. Our landing cost at Trinidad was $700 US, just to put an island of wheels on the ground, $700, and that reflects in the price we have to charge. Since I've been sitting here this morning, I've just got a quote for a small tube to go in a nose wheel, which was $4,500 US for a small tube. If on my car I've got a headlight, a light that goes wrong, I'll go to a shop and I'll pay $25 for a bulb. If that same bulb has written on the side, approved for aviation use, put a nought on it, it'll go from 25 to 250 because of the safety factors involved. So operating aircraft is very, very expensive and getting more expensive. I agree entirely. Fares between here and Antigua are high, but why? Because the costs are high. The Antiguan tax of $37.50 US in, $37.50 out, just about kills the day trip market. People would have to pay $75 US to the government in Antigua for the privilege of coming to Montserrat for the day.
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
Can I just add something else on cost? The fares that we're charging at the moment are designed to give us a small profit. But for any company, it's not just an airline, for it to reinvest into new equipment has to have its prices set at an amount that gives you enough profit to actually reinvest into your equipment. And we're nowhere near that. We haven't got enough money to go and buy a new Tecnam aircraft. We can't go out on the market, the money market, and get someone to lend us that money because we can't write a business plan because there's no access policy that we can write a business plan for. So we're absolutely stuck unless the British government can somehow help us to acquire aircraft, or that government here somehow organises things so that we can reinvest our money in equipment rather than paying taxes, for instance.
I mean, last year we're probably going to pay some tax because we had a reasonably good year. You can only spend the dollar once. We either retain that as profit, where we promise to use it to invest in new aircraft, hangars, infrastructure, or we give it to the government in taxes. You can't spend that dollar two ways.
Just one follow-up question, if you don't mind, just on the very subject. Are you saying then, without significant subsidies, that the people, the passengers, are paying the cost of maintenance, the high cost of not having a hangar, travel further away, and all the other fuel costs increases, the passengers are paying this? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, where else could it come from? The money has to come from somewhere to pay for all those things, and the only way that that can be paid for is ticket prices and charters.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Ms. Greenaway.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Harris, for the information you provided so far. Now, just so that we get a holistic approach, I know that we've moved on to other topics, but I just wish to briefly take you back to the issue of the hangar, which you mentioned. Now, you did talk about the absence of one, so I just want to quickly know how your aircraft are stored when they're not in use.
outside on the ramp at the airport.
Okay.
I mean, that's quite common practice. Where we need a hangar is not for storage, even though that would be nice, that's a bonus. The real reason is to do maintenance. So at the moment we have approval from our regulator to do line maintenance. So that's the minor servicing, defect rectification. For every 100 hours they have to go to Anguilla to have a deeper inspection, if you like.
Okay. So has this absence resulted in increased costs for Fly Montserrat?
Well, clearly, if we have to take an aeroplane an hour up the road to Anguilla, there's an increased cost factor on that. Plus the fact if we had a hangar here, we could do progressive maintenance. So the aircraft would be available to revenue fly rather than sitting on the ground having maintenance.
Okay. You spoke... Sorry, yeah, sure.
Given what you've explained about having a hangar for deeper maintenance, that would in any way affect the safety of our planes?
No, nothing affects the safety in this context because aircraft are maintained to a schedule and our regulator visits us regularly to inspect the airplanes to make sure we're behaving ourselves and doing things properly. So it doesn't affect safety, but it affects cost and convenience. Obviously, if we've got the aeroplane here, it's easier to work on it, as I say, on progressive maintenance. We can work on it at 6 o'clock in the morning, etc. Whereas opposed to taking up to Anguilla, we have to take the pilot up, fly the pilot back up again. There's an additional cost. So in terms of convenience and cost, we need a hangar. Plus the fact that Montserrat shouldn't be dependent on people outside. I've already told you about the problems with fuel. We're dependent on the people in Antigua for our fuel. No fuel, no fly. I don't have control over that. In the same way, if there was a problem with our maintenance supplier, who are very good and we're very happy with, but in Anguilla, they will give priority to their aircraft, not Montserrat aircraft. I want everything in-house at Montserrat, so we can be self-sufficient. We've had an apprenticeship scheme for our pilots running for several years. I would like to do the same with engineers, so we can train engineers here in Montserrat and create jobs and prosperity for Montserrat. So I think we should be talking about Montserrat and not helping people outside. The people in St. Vincent don't help me, so why are we helping the people of St. Vincent?
If I may I, sorry. You once, if I remember correctly, said on record on radio, the very same thing you're saying now. You additionally said that because of not having a hangar, you cannot do thorough inspections or something of that nature.
Yeah, it's things like splitting an engine because there's dust in the air. I mean, we have ash in the air as well. But if you split an engine, then dust could get inside. So we can't do that here.
If I remember correctly, and I will get the clip, where you actually said that you do have to fly around with minor glitches or something of that nature. Is that?
Sorry,
you
fly around with?
Minor glitches, minor...
No, any aeroplane that's flying is carrying minor glitches. When the 777 arrives British Airways in Antigua, it's probably got 2 pages of minor glitches. You've got a complex machinery, and we've got a document that clearly defines which in your language is a minor glitch and one that wouldn't be safe for the aircraft to fly. And if it's the latter, then the aircraft is grounded until it's fixed. Minor glitches, yeah, sure.
Okay, and clearly you've made the case to ASI and to the FCDO and the governor, wouldn't you have?
The case for what?
For a hangar.
Yes, we've made, I think, 4 propositions for a hangar, and they all remain unanswered.
Okay.
Ms. Winaway?
Okay, so to jump ahead a little, you did speak about the engineers that inspect Fly Montserrat's aircrafts every 100 hours?
No, we do progressive. We have a minor inspection at 25 hours, slightly deeper at 50 hours, then 100, then 500, and then every 2 years, a 1,000-hour check, which is really deep, where you tear the airplane apart, basically.
Okay, so just for our understanding, so the 25 hours, where does that take place?
We do the 25 and the 50-hour checks here on island, and then the 100-hour, 500, and 1,000 have to go to Anguilla.
Okay. Are you willing to share that inspection schedule?
Sorry?
Are you willing to share with us the schedule of inspections?
What you mean, what has to happen?
No.
The record.
Yes, your record of it.
Our record?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, everything's highly documented in aviation.
Great.
Okay.
But as I say, we have independent audits and audits from the regulator where they do just that. And if we made a mistake on a piece of paper, we're in deep trouble. So it's a very regulated industry.
And I'm sorry. The inspections, okay, so you spoke about the qualified engineers in Anguilla doing the 100+ hours. The inspections that are conducted in Montserrat, 2550, can you tell me who conducts those inspections?
We have a fully licensed qualified engineer on island. He's been here with us for a long time. We had another one before him. He works essentially under the auspices of our base maintenance in Anguilla because we're working under their approval. So not only is he approved by the regulator, ASI, he also has to be approved by our friends. So he's a fully licensed and he can sign aircraft off, so that's really important.
Okay. And the hangar facilities are not necessary for those?
Not for the minor checks,
okay.
no. As I say, it's when you get to the bigger checks. Obviously, if you've got an aircraft in pieces and it starts raining hard, that's not good unless you got cover.
Yes, you were asked about where your airplanes were stored. Question, how does not having night security affect your risks?
We don't like it. We would like night security. There are all sorts of problems with security at the airport at the moment, like the X-ray machine hasn't been working for many weeks, which delayed our flight yesterday. The airport, speaking on their behalf, is starved of money. They need money on the airport to do the things that the airport should do. So I'm just making a little plea, please give the airport some money. They are struggling a bit. But yes, no security at night does not make our insurers very comfortable. It doesn't make us very comfortable. I'm not particularly worried about terrorism, but I am worried about someone who may be slightly mentally challenged, dare I say, climbing over a fence and putting nasty things in the tanks of our airplane. That worries me. That keeps me awake at night. So yes, I would like security at the airport, please.
And surely you've made this case to ASI, to the governor, and the government of Montserrat?
Yes, very much so, to all three. ASI's view is it's an issue for the government here to make sure their premises are secure.
The issue of safety of your aircraft and the possibility of tampering with your aircraft is an issue?
That's something we've mentioned, but it's really for the airport. It's their airport. We will support them totally on this one. Total support from Fly Montserrat. But it's their security. They have to do what they think is right. And if this is a cost-saving exercise, which I assume, I think that's very badly judged.
Isn't safety an issue or security an issue for the governor herself?
Yes, and without speaking for the governor again, I think you'll find that she would prefer we had night security. But I suggest you ask her that question.
Perhaps I should ask you, what is the reason given to you for removing night security, and who removed it as far as you were told?
Oh, well, the airport removed it. Reasons? No, I think this is really something you should be asking government.
But you must have been given an explanation when you asked.
I'll cynically say that it's always money.
It's always money.
But I'm not saying that as a fact, I'm just giving you an opinion.
2 officers at night?
No, there was 1, I believe.
1 at night?
I believe so, yeah.
That's an issue of money.
Your question on this should be directed to government.
It will be, but I want to be sure when I ask them that they're telling me what they told you.
I'm just asking the question, why was it removed?
Yes, thank you.
But we would support reinstating it because it would improve security. There was a case at Anguilla 2 years ago where someone did just that, climbed over the fence in the middle of the night, but on this occasion actually stole the aircraft at 3 o'clock in the morning, actually took off on a closed airport and stole an aircraft. So Anguilla, which is also an OT, had the experience, so there is the possibility.
Thank you.
Bearing in mind the government's concerns are security of the airport and not necessarily the aircraft, what steps have you been able to undertake recently in light of the changes in security at the airport? What steps have you, additional steps rather, have you been able to undertake to secure the safety of your aircraft?
Okay, well, we have a security program, which for obvious reasons I'm not going to go into. We work with the UK security people. We have regular meetings under the auspices of the governor discussing in the round security on the island. And one of those elements was obviously night security. I'm sure our next meeting will be discussing the, yet again, breakdown of the X-ray machines. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a breakdown in security because they hand search baggage. But obviously it takes longer, therefore the flights are delayed, and maybe if you have a connection in Antigua, you miss it because of the security one. So, and again, I think that's a money issue, that the airport needs money to maintain its equipment, and it's not getting it at the moment.
Great.
Mr. Harris, so I want to go back to qualifications. This was something we should have addressed earlier, but as you may have gathered, based on your responses, we tended to jump ahead a bit. Okay, so let's talk about your qualifications. Are you trained as a pilot?
Me?
Yes.
Me personally? Yes, I've got 20,000 hours experience, 10,000 of those are training.
Okay, so what are the required qualifications for a pilot to conduct flights on behalf of Fly Montserrat?
Okay, so there are two different dimensions to your question. One is the regulator, and we've agreed that's ASI. So we have to produce a training manual. Within that, it's set down the minimum hours, the minimum training, the tests, the checks and balances that they have to undertake. So in addition to their flying tests, they have about 8 or 9 different ground subjects they have to pass, like security, dangerous goods, first aid, etc. And then they have their flying checks, which, other than the fact that I used to do some of those checks, we actually bring in an independent UK Civil Aviation Authority examiner to independently test them. And then when ASI are here, they will fly with a selection just to make sure that they, ASI, are satisfied. So all that is documented in our operations training manual, and that document has to be approved by ASI. So if I put down something that's unacceptable, they just don't approve it. So it has to be approved. A bigger criteria, in a way, these days are our insurers. So our insurers, totally separate to whatever the regulator wants, sets down their requirements. So when we employ a new pilot, we have to run all that past the insurer, who then takes it to the underwriter, and they take a view on whether they're prepared to insure them. If you can't insure them, they haven't got a job. So there are two sort of fairly serious implications. One is the regulator has to approve who's flying our airplanes, and then secondly, so does our insurer.
What are the standard maximum flying hours for a pilot per day? And this all goes back to a safety issue.
Again, that's regulated. The airport controllers and ourselves both have to have what's called an FTL scheme, a flight time limitation scheme, where it sets down the maximum hours. I won't give it's a big, thick document, so I'm not going to bore it with you. But in ballpark terms, the pilot can only fly 900 hours a year. So once it hits 900, that's it. Now out here, because we're flying short sectors, that's not a problem, we never get to it. So there's a limitation on the flying hours. But more relevant is a limitation on their duty hours. So their duty hours includes their ground duties as well as their flying. In rough terms, it's 55 hours a week, 95 hours in 2 weeks, and it goes on. As I say, it's quite a complex scheme. But if you just want a rough idea, they can only they can only do 55 duty hours per week.
So I'm gathering that the Fly Montserrat pilots, they're likely not to reach that.
They don't reach other than maybe a week at Christmas and a week at St. Patrick's, where we have to look very closely at their hours. I mean, there are also limitations. I say it's a big document. They have to have 2 days off every 14. So, you know, their time off is there. And if they came on, not what we do in Montserrat, but if they came to work at 3 o'clock in the morning, that reduces the limit on how many hours they can fly. So it's quite complex, but it's an approved scheme scheme, and it's regularly looked at by the regulator. I'm surprised none of you have asked me the question about night flying at the airport.
About in the meantime, are you? In the meantime, the document that you mentioned, the document you last mentioned, including the operation manual, those are something that if we were to request that, you'd be willing to?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the security element. I think I might get it. But you're welcome to look at our training manual, welcome to look at our FDL scheme. Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't want it circulating electrically, but if you want to come and look at it, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Now, okay, so in terms of pilots, again, health screening. Sorry, health screening for pilots.
Yes. You mean their medicals?
Yes.
Okay, so
can you give me some information as to how that works? You know, how often are they required to conduct health screening?
Okay. It depends on their age, and again, it's a little complex, but just to give you a rough idea, they need a medical with a civil aviation approved doctor, not any old doctor, it has to be an approved one, of which we have one in Antigua, so it's not a problem. Dr. Williams in Antigua, and it's basically every 6 months.
Okay, so prior to your first flight with Fly Montserrat, you received that clearance?
Well, they have to produce us a valid medical.
Right.
It doesn't need to be valid for 6 months, it has to be valid.
Every 6 months, you're issued.
Yeah, but if he came to us with 3 months of it gone, that's fine.
And that, okay, yeah. So that is relied on to determine suitability to fly. Yeah. Correct?
Yeah, every 6 months they need a medical. In rough terms, there are exceptions to that. Yeah. Everything in aviation, I'm afraid, is complex. Sometimes it's not a yes-no answer.
I understand.
Entirely up to you. We're fine. Your call.
We spoke about Nigel. If there's a good way to start. Yes? Tell us. Why did you play it?
Simple answer, the airport is not licensed for night flying.
What would it require in your opinion for night flying?
Well, I can tell you more in our opinion because we've just done the exercise. The instigator actually was the governor, but the instigator has to be the airport authority. So the airport authority needs to say to the regulator, we wish our license to also cover flights during the time of darkness, night. Right, and you have to look what night means. As I say, everything aviation is complicated. The law says that night is 30 minutes after sunset. I'm forgetting the morning because we don't normally fly at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's the evenings, so the critical time. So the law is 30 minutes after sunset. But because we're close to the equator and twilight is shorter, the airport here have their own rule that night is defined as sunset plus 15, half the legal one. So it doesn't bother us, you know, sort of Easter through to about now because it's not dark till about 10 to 7 o'clock. But at Christmas, peak time, and St. Patrick's to a degree, it gets dark 20 to 6 at the worst case. So that means that we have this squeeze window, which I talked about in Antigua, where the flights come in between 2 and 4. We want to fly between 4 and that it gets tighter for our guys to do 2 rotations with the airport closing at 20 to 6. The other element is that up to 3 years ago, we used to be able to go at night on medivacs, just depart, go to Guadeloupe, go to Antigua, with critical medivacs, and we did quite a few, right. The regulator then stopped that and said, no, you can't do that because the airport is not night, whatever. So at the instigation of the governor, probably 6-9 months ago, we asked the airport formally to get approval for night flying. which I assume they've done with ASI. ASI asked us for a risk assessment, and I assume they also asked the airport for a risk assessment. We completed ours several months ago, returned it to the airport and to ASI, and we've had no comments on that so far.
Can I just ask briefly about the gist of that risk assessment? Because one of my questions, follow-up questions to you, was whether you think the airport and obviously Fly Montserrat as well are equipped to accommodate night flights.
Okay, again, not a simple answer. Back in 2014, the government commissioned a report from Mott MacDonald, who are about the biggest in the business, very reputable company, and it asked about alternative means of compliance to RESA that we touched on, and I'll park that one, but it also asked Mott MacDonald to lay out the requirements for the airport to be licensed by night, at night. That report, I don't think it's ever been read by anyone here. I dread to think how much it costs, but we've never had any feedback on that report at all. So when it was suggested a few months ago we should revisit night flying, I said that they should go back to the MacDonald report because essentially it's still valid. So night flying, when you say the airport is not too bad. We've got runway lights, we've got some obstruction lights. We're back to money again. I don't know if you've seen, but there are 2 floodlights on the apron, and one is fallen down. Literally, the light fell onto the surface. And if you go up to the airport now, you'll find cones around the light showing it's dangerous to walk near them because a light may let. This is all about money. I'm sorry, the airport is starved of money. So we would need the lights to be fixed. The airport is very close to being in a state for approval. However, there's always a however, isn't there? What we do need is some obstruction lights around the island, particularly on the Silver Hills, where our aircraft is flying in the circuit pattern. So I'm fairly sure that ASI would be asking for some lights on significant instructions. And the source document, the point to start, I would say, is the Mott MacDonald report of 2014. If we can satisfy, or the airport can satisfy ASI, that the obstruction lights are up, then they come back to the operators. And remember, we're not the only operator. If our risk assessment is acceptable to them, which I think it will be, and they approve us as an operator, then it's up to the airport to get their license changed to permit night flying. This is really important at Christmas, where we've already talked about the window of flying being fairly short, but there is another issue that at Christmas, when the snowbirds want to fly, the weather is at its worst usually in Northern America, Canada, and Europe. They get fog, ice, and all the problems we don't have. That means that flights are delayed coming out of Europe and North America, so they don't arrive into Antigua until later, maybe an hour, 2 hours late, which means that our flight, the airport, would be closed. Okay? I had the same circumstance on my medevac on Friday, I'm sorry to go back to that, where we were having issues with ambulances and it looked like we were going to be longer on the ground in Trinidad, which didn't happen eventually, but had that happened, I couldn't have got back to Montserrat that night. So myself, a doctor said we would have had to stay the night in Trinidad because the airport's closed. So there are lots of advantages to the public by having the airport open. Also to our economy, if people stay the night in Antigua, they're not spending money on Montserrat. So from an economic perspective, there is an economic case for getting the airport opened and spending some money on obstruction lights. Secondary to that, but I'll just feed you the question is, why can't we land in bad weather? And the answer is because we haven't got an instrument approach. Now, that's separate to the night flying, right? It would help at night, obviously, but it's during the daytime some will be delayed, usually when showers come through. But if it's 4:30 in the afternoon, that means we don't get back in time before it's dark again. With GPS, it's now relatively cheap to put an instrument approach in. I say relatively because, as we've discussed, everything in aviation is expensive, nothing's cheap. But compared to a few years ago, it would be not unduly expensive to put in an instrument approach. And that would allow us to get in virtually any weather other than hurricanes and things, which obviously we're not going to be here. But other than hurricanes, we should be able to operate pretty much all the time without delays. So yes, we need a hangar, we need fuel, we need night flying, and we would very much like an instrument approach.
Just for further elucidate, tell us about instrument approach. What does that involve?
Okay, we don't really get low cloud in the Caribbean like you do in the States or in Europe. I mean, this time of year in England, if I was flying, I'd expect not to see the airport until 200 feet off the ground. That would be normal. Out here, there's not normally cloud below 1,500, 2,000 feet. But sometimes we get squall lines where it's drizzling, raining, and the airport here will decide in their wisdom that the weather is below visual flight rules. That's a different conversation whether we agree with that decision. But at the moment, they can say the airport's closed because the weather's too bad. If I go to Antigua, we can make an instrument approach, and you'd normally get the runway by 600-700 feet, and therefore you land. Here, if they say the airport is below visual conditions, it means we have to go back to Antigua. We can't get in here. Now, if you put in an instrument approach, that will have a minima associated with it. But as I say, I've never seen cloud in the Caribbean below 600-700 feet. Maybe one little puffy one, but essentially we don't get cloud that low. So by putting in an instrument approach, other than hurricanes and severe thunderstorms, we would get in, I would suggest, 9 times out of 10. So it just makes it easier to land.
Okay. Are there any instances where the determination to fly is made by the pilot of the airline as opposed to the air tower staff?
Okay, pilots have operational control over the flight. So as soon as the door is closed on boarding until the door is opened on landing, the pilot has total command of that flight. Okay, I'm the boss. If I say to the pilot, you will fly, they can say, sorry, boss, we're not going to. And the law is on their side, quite rightly. In the same way with air traffic, the pilot ultimately makes the decision. That's the law.
Are you saying that the pilots can be pressured by you into making that decision?
They could be, but it wouldn't work. None of my pilots are going to accept that. It would never, ever get to that. It would never, ever get to that situation.
And where does the air traffic controller come into the whole?
It depends where. Some air traffic is advisory, some of it is positive. Like in Antigua, because they have instrument approaches, or Guadeloupe, where they have radar, it's positive control. So if the controller says turn left to turn right, you better do it because that's what he's telling you. But here, for example, we have no radar and no instrument approaches. A lot of it is advisory, but if the controller says I'm closing the airport, then it's up to the pilot to make a decision. Is the safe option to land, because he's here? We've had situations where that happens a long time ago, not recently. Or does he actually divert back to Antigua? The pilot will make a judgment on what is the safest option. It's always about safety.
Has there been a recent change in who determines when to land or not to land?
There's not been a recent change, but I think some of the training has made it clearer, the training they've received from ASI.
What do you mean by recent? Well, we need to clarify recent. In the past 10 years, has there been any change?
Past 5 years. No, there's been no significant change, other than I think that the controllers here are far better trained now than they were 5 years ago.
So there's no change in the role of the air traffic controller in deciding when or when an airplane should not land?
No, the rules are the same as they've always been. What's changed possibly is the implementation of those rules.
Perhaps you need to explain.
Well, you have rules, and then you have to interpret them to what that actually means from a practical sense.
Yes.
The rules, to the best of my knowledge, on VFR, IFR, which is what we're talking, haven't actually changed very much. What's changed slightly is that there's been a lot more training going on in the last 5 years, so therefore there is clarity about implementation.
Are you saying if the air traffic controller is convinced that the light or the other circumstances affecting landing are unsuitable, that he can stop the pilot?
He can say the airport is closed, absolutely.
Not closed. Prevent him from landing.
Well,
If he's already in the air.
Closed, how would he stop him landing? You can't physically stop him, can you? So closing the airport...
Instruct.
Well, the instruction is either the airport's open or it's closed.
What of a circumstance where an airplane leaves Antigua for Montserrat and the weather changes? Antigua gives the okay to leave, and mid-air on the way to Montserrat, it's difficult either to go to St. Kitts or to Montserrat. They're running out of fuel. What is the option then for an aircraft coming to Montserrat?
So that's what I meant about training and implication. Maybe 10 years ago, the scenario you've described could have happened. These days it won't, because in the tower here and our pilots have all got laptops that show current weather in real terms. So before we leave Antigua, we check the weather. I mean, it's not perfect, but I mean, we're quite good at interpreting weather. And the guys in the tower here have also got it. They've also got their eyeballs, so they can look outside the tower and see what the weather is. So we as pilots would check with air traffic here, is weather okay? Is it looking okay for landing? But also air traffic in Antigua will call Montserrat before we leave and say, you know, Montserrat 807 is ready to taxi, can you accept them? And they'd say yes or no. So we anticipate the problem, not react to it. That's what I meant by training and how things have moved on from 5 years ago. We have the benefit of having computers that show us weather, and we have a better dialogue between air traffickers and pilots.
So you're saying this has not happened recently?
What's not happened?
Where an airplane has been coming and the weather's
We've not
changed.
had an aircraft turn back, certainly in 5 years.
You have not had one that was forced to land when it was not appropriate because of the weather change?
You mean where we've been told the airport's closed and we've landed anyway?
No. Where they're running out of fuel and they're told the circumstances
running
to
out of
land.
fuel is not going to happen because we have contingency fuel, reserve fuel. So fuel is not the issue. We have plenty of fuel to return to Antigua.
Thank you.
So there is not a safety issue here.
Thank you.
Contract.
It's very, very rare that we would cancel a flight. If it's due to weather or operational reasons, what usually happens is that the flight gets delayed, it doesn't get cancelled, and will leave at such point that it can leave. Okay, it depends on the reason that the delay has happened. If it's because of weather or industrial action in Antigua or something of that nature that's completely outside our control, then our responsibility is to bring them as soon as we can after that problem is solved. Now, if it's a late afternoon flight, it's going to be the next morning. So they would then be finding their own accommodation in Antigua, come back to check in. We would give them a time the next morning, and they would return the next morning at the time that they've been told their flight will leave, and that's when they'll then arrive in Montserrat. Now, if for any reason it was our fault that we weren't leaving, then we would have to put them up for the night and get them back to the airport again. Because there's no night flying, it does mean an overnight. If it's passengers going out and there's a significant delay because of weather or whatever, that means that they might miss their connection, then we will either take them as soon as the weather clears or offer them another flight if they've missed a connection, for instance.
Is there?
I don't know if it's a legal one, but it's a morally right one.
A morally one. Okay.
If I can give you an example, on, I believe it was Friday last week, British Airways were running about 5 hours late. right, which clearly meant they're going to be landing well after our airport had closed. So I had the phone call, strangely enough, from our access coordinator, who was one of the stranded passengers, saying, could we put on extra flights? And we're saying, well, yeah, but who's going to pay for it? Because it's not our fault that you're stranded, it's British Airways' fault. Now, what he didn't know, and I've now told him, which may be useful to you and your listeners, that any European airline, British Airways, Virgin, by law have to pay compensation. They have to put you up, give you a meal, give you a phone call, and pay you around 600 euros compensation. Depends what class you're travelling in. But for this conversation, 600 euros is a ballpark figure. Therefore, these 5 people that were abandoned, 5 times 600, 3,000 US, they've got more than enough to charter with us. So BA have already put in place the compensation which will cover them for their consequential loss.
And would you support them in making the case to the airline, in that you verify what has happened?
Produce a letter saying they've missed our flight because Montserrat's closed. Yeah, absolutely.
And have you told this to the customers? Have you made this public, information public?
I've not been approached by anybody who's had a problem. Back to the Honourable Dorset Hector's question about legal obligation or whatever. I mean, obviously there are terms and conditions on our tickets, which they agree to when they book, and which has cancellation terms and so on in there, and what happens in the event of a delay or something like that.
The ticket is a contract, so the answer to your question is legal obligations are subject to the contracts, that's contract law.
So it's very important that passengers read the contents of that contract before they pay.
Yes, and I'm sure you do.
Just another question, please. It was not...
So this contract,
You might.
this contract that we talked about, that we're speaking of, that they should read before they pay, just so I get the ticketing process correctly, you provide your information, it's keyed into the system. At what stage before payment are you allowed to read these terms and conditions? Okay. Is there something given to you?
If you are booking online, I mean, every term and condition is written on the website under terms and conditions, and you can go to that and you can see the lot. And as with any airline, it is quite long. It's not something that you can put on your ticket. So we condense down what I call the important things that most people are affected by, which is the weight restriction, the baggage allowance, the check-in closing time, the fact that the fares are non-refundable but are changeable for a fee, those sort of important ones that are the usual questions that you actually have on your itinerary when it's printed off. So those are not small print, those are in your face. When you're booking online, you actually tick a box that says that you're agreeing to the company's terms and conditions in buying that ticket. Okay. And you can click on them to see what they are.
But in person, because we know in Montserrat people still do purchase tickets in person. So in person, I am told this is the cost of the flight. Do you, at that stage, does the airline at that stage direct someone to the full terms and conditions before payment is made? Do you give them something that indicates these are the terms and conditions, a synopsis of at least? And
good question. What we do depends if the girls in the office tend to know who are repeat passengers or if something's changed. But what we always say as we hand over or they hand over their money or their payment is that the most important terms and conditions are mentioned, which is that we're taking your payment. Once paid, your fare is non-refundable but changeable for a fee. And please look at these terms and conditions here on your itinerary before you leave the office to ensure that you're happy with what you've got, as well as actually checking that the flight that they've been booked on is what they think they've booked.
But can you with certainty say that this is conveyed, even if it's an instance where it's a repeat customer?
The answer about the fares being non-refundable but changeable for a fee, and to check the itinerary as it's handed over is done by the office.
Yeah. But although I'm particularly interested in the aspect of it which addresses what takes place in the event that a flight is cancelled.
Well, that is in the long terms and conditions, because it's quite complex and you actually have to go onto the website.
No, I understand that, but I'm just trying to confirm whether or not this is conveyed by the members of staff at the office to persons before they purchase the ticket. That you definitely need to visit the website or wherever to see all.
It's written on their itinerary exactly where they can get the full terms and conditions.
And you get the itinerary after payment.
It's a money itinerary. There you go. It's all in one. It's one transaction.
So until I've paid, I don't know that you're sending me to the website, and this may happen.
No, possibly not.
Yeah, possibly not. But I mean,
But if you come back and say, I disagree with condition number 3, we'll say, there's your money back.
Okay. Thank you for, thank you for that
we
response.
ask them to check what's on their itinerary before they leave. If anybody has any issue, they can ask.
Okay. Okay. But thank you for your response.
A support question, if you don't mind.
Question?
Perhaps you can tell us off the cuff under what circumstances you do pay for overnight stays when inconvenience
Yes, I
passengers in
think
Antigua.
I've already alluded to that and said that if it's our fault.
What sort of fault? What?
I mean, for instance, if
considered?
we had a technical problem and we couldn't depart, that's down to us.
Mm-hmm.
If it's the fact that security aren't working in Antigua and they can't get through, that's not down to us. If it's because the weather's too bad, that's not down to us. So it's a question of whether it's our responsibility for what's happened or whether it's outside forces.
I know of an incident where the Bowser, as you said, was failing to provide petrol, and passengers waited for several hours while they were told the matter was being addressed. Then finally told at the end of the day that the flight couldn't travel. By then, they couldn't charter with SVG or anyone else.
Good question. Good question. We've never, ever got to the point of having to overnight people. We've got within about 30 seconds of it, right, where we've been pleading with the guys here to keep up. So we've always managed to get back, right, where we got fuel, or we've managed to find fuel some other way. But so it's never actually happened, but it could. It could. I would probably sue the fuel supplier.
Okay, good to hear. That's it.
Just to take us back again to the European Airlines coming, one of the concerns that have been raised is direct baggaging. Interline. Can you tell us about that and what prevents us from having that?
But we're very happy, right? The problems with Interline are fault. It's global distribution system is what you're talking about, which is GDS. Which I have to say most airlines are actually leaving at the moment as opposed to going in. And I'll tell you why. It costs about 14% on a ticket price to work through GDS. Right? So whatever we're charging now, multiply it by 114, it's going to cost 14% more. We don't like that. The passengers don't like that. I wouldn't have thought you guys were very happy about the fare going up 14%. So it is a cost to having GDS. There are also some big technical problems. One, there is who is liable for what. So if you check in at Gatwick or JFK, an American or BA accepts your ticket, do they issue you then with a boarding card through to Montserrat? If they do, who is responsible if something goes wrong, as Mr. Romeo was asking just now? And the same going back. Who is responsible? The airlines, the big airlines, don't like it unless they're dealing between Lufthansa and BA, whatever, where they know they have lots of resources. They're not happy, very happy with us little guys that don't have lots of resources. So we could do it. We've actually had conversations with Virgin and BA. What it does, it gives you visibility. So the issue has always been, if I go into a travel agent in Birmingham or Australia and say, I want to fly to Montserrat, they can't see Montserrat on their computer. There's no visibility. They can only see Antigua. Okay? So to get that visibility, you need to get in a GDS. We also have another problem in that if you pay through GDS, we don't see the money for months. Right? So it's a cash flow implication to an airline. Well, cash flow is quite important to us. And if we're not getting paid for 3 months, we're not too happy. So, yes, we've looked at GDS. I actually made a proposal to the tourism office probably 7 or 8 years ago, where we had an offer from one of the major GDS people of a half-price deal if we came in. And I said I would split that with them 50-50. We'd pay 50% if they paid 50%. Never got a response. So.
Thank you.
Can I just add something there? There's one other consequence of having GDS interline agreements, and that is the interval between the arrival of the intercontinental flight, shall we say, and the time of our departure. Because they don't want to be responsible for bags that haven't made it onto our flight, they demand that there's a 2.5-hour minimum time difference between their arrival and, say, our departure, which means nobody in the winter would get on the afternoon flights if they were coming by that route, whereas most passengers know the system in Antigua, shall we say, and might take a risk that 2.5 hours is more than ample, although we always recommend 2.5 hours, and say, I'm going to do it in less than 2. But you wouldn't be able to do that because it would be precluded from the booking engine.
Finally, I forgot baggage being touched on. If you're travelling up the front of British Airways, you're allowed 3 suitcases plus a carry-on. We would be obliged in our interline agreement with BA to carry those 3, and we all know what that's going to do to a small aeroplane. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, sorry, you spoke about the RISA earlier. Could you tell us whether your aircraft ever overruns the RISA area, runs into the RISA area on landing, or on departure? Does the aircraft use the RISA area in turning or anything of that nature?
No, as I stated earlier, in round terms, the maximum runway we need for an islander is about 400 metres. I say about because it depends on the temperature, it depends on the wind, it depends on the weight of the aircraft. It depends what you mean overran the RISA area. Once the airplane has landed and it's slowed down to a crawl, if you like, we tell our guys to go to the end of the runway because there's a turning circle, there's more room for them to manoeuvre to turn round. So at that stage, they're in the RISA area, but with an aeroplane that's totally under control. So the answer to your question is yes, but it doesn't matter because that's purely for the purpose of turning around.
So you're saying you only go into the RISA area on landing for turning purposes?
Yeah, that's right. But it's there as a safety fudge factor.
And on departure, you use the RISA area on the other end for turning only?
Well, if you're departing, you're not going to be turning, are you?
When you're departing, you turn and then fly?
Oh, sorry, at the other end. Absolutely, yes. You want to use as much of the runway as possible. I mean, there's an expression in aviation, there's nothing more useless than runway that's behind you. So we want to use the full length for takeoff.
Okay, so you're saying because you only need 400 feet...
Meters.
400 meters, sorry. You normally land within the RISA required area with no difficulty.
That's not technically right. The RISA is a theoretical number that is used for performance calculations. It's not real. It's a fudge factor there that makes it safer that we can't use when we're doing our performance calculation. But it's a bit back to our analogy of a twin otter landing with reverse thrust. He can't use that in his performance, in its planning, but insurers can use it for real. So of course we're going to use the RESA for takeoff and for landing. But it's a theoretical number. We've already, every flight we do, we calculate performance. It's a legal obligation. So the pilot produces a load sheet which demonstrates that he's taking off within his weight limits, certificate of gravity, and performance. So he can't use that RESA for his calculation. But in practice, of course you can use it. As I said, the 600 metres of concrete is still there. We haven't dug it up.
So it's theoretical?
It's theoretical, yeah.
I'm told that a RESA is also important in retarding the continuation of an aircraft that may be running speedily into that area. So it retards going further. There's no...
That's another Montserrat myth, I'm afraid. I mean, it's just a space. When they actually tarmac the runway, resurface it, it's the same from one end of the 600 to the other. There's no special surface.
The Twin Otter has been landing here for some 20 plus years.
Yes.
You're aware of that?
Yes.
And are you saying that it was not landing within those 400 meters when it landed?
Again, that's an unanswerable question because I'm not doing performance on a Twin Otter.
No.
So you'd really need to talk to a Twin Otter, and it depends what they have written. It depends what they have written in their operations manual and accepted by their regulator. What I am saying is you cannot include reverse thrust for the purpose of performance.
When was that decided?
Before my lifetime, as long as I can remember. I've been flying for 50 years, at least
However,
50 years.
Do you refute the fact that the Twin Otter has been landing here for 20 plus years without incident and within the same required 400-meter distance?
It's a question you have to ask the operator.
So you're not aware
It's
of
not
that?
a question that they can't use reverse thrust. They can, and they do, but they can't use it for performance calculations. Okay. Now, one of the questions you should be asking them, not us, is the Twin Otter is a DH6. DH stands for de Havilland, good old British company that used to make Twin Otters up there in Toronto, I believe. And they sold out several years ago to a company called Viking, which is based in Victoria, Canada. And Mr. Viking went, we want to build new expensive airplanes and make some money. So they made a variant called a Dash 400, which is quite a different aeroplane. It's got glass cockpit and all sorts of goodies, all right? I believe, but again, you need to talk to the operators, because they want to sell their new airplanes and cynically make some money, they said, do you know what? We no longer support stall performance in the old Twin Otters. You know, if you wanted 300, 200, bear on your head. We, as a manufacturer, want you to buy our 400s. So that, several years ago, changed the rules, not by the regulator, but simply because de Havilland, or Viking as it now is, didn't want to support their old... If I may finish, this is really important. We're not supporting their old product. Now, it's then up to the operators to come up with what's called an alternative means of compliance. I did say this was complex, but you asked me the question. The alternative means of compliance has to be something that they document, give to their regulator, their CAA, and say, if we do this, can we still operate as a STOL aircraft? And for example, one of the conditions was their pilots had to go to Toronto, I believe, every 6 months to have simulator checks to make sure they could cope with it. So there was all sorts of restrictions. Now, what ASI, our regulator, is saying, this is not them saying their rules, they're saying this is ICAO rules. In your performance, you cannot use reverse thrust. So hang on. Therefore, demonstrate to us as the regulator of John A. Osborne Airport, demonstrate to us what weight you can land with without the use of reverse thrust. And as I understand it, they were unable to do that, even though the pilots have to do it on every single flight.
Is it that they were not able to do it within 24 hours when they had already scheduled flights, which they normally conduct? Is that the case?
But as I just said to you, the pilot does this calculation on every single flight, not once a year. Therefore, it would take a pilot 5 minutes to give ASI the answer to their question.
So when did it become a requirement?
Sorry?
When did that become a requirement? When was there a change? Because the Twin Otter was landing for 20 plus years on the same strip and was allowed to land?
I've answered that. I'll do it again. First of all, nothing's changed recently in terms of reverse thrust. It's been there as long as I can remember.
Yes.
But secondly, what Viking have done with their Stoll supplement, I'm not competent to say because I'm not operating it.
When was that done?
I'm guessing whenever they bought the de Havilland type certification off de Havilland.
Is that before 2020?
I've no idea. You'd have to ask an operator, right? However, the operator has to comply with the manufacturer and their regulator. And our regulator says, listen, chaps, just to remind you, you can't use reverse thrust in a performance calculation. Absolutely fair and reasonable.
However, I'm just being very practical here. The Twin Otter has landed for many, many years without incident, carrying a full payload, using very little of the airtrip successfully. Isn't that the case?
I can't answer it. I would have to say to you, the Twin Otter that landed at St. Bart's 3 weeks ago obviously had a problem.
One incident.
How many do you want?
I'm told that they... No, I'm trying to get it
But
clear.
because someone has been doing something for 20 years doesn't mean it's right.
No.
And I'm not suggesting it's not right,
that's
but
not
you
the point.
need to talk to the
Forgive
operator.
me. I'm allowing you to educate us and help the public to understand from a professional point of view why the change has come, why was it suddenly enforced, if anything, because whether there was a change that took place at the very time or not. That's the question.
Can I just say, really, this isn't a question for us.
Okay.
It's a question for a Twin Otter operator,
Yeah, exactly.
the regulator, and...
But my answer to you is nothing changed other than the actual making it happen. The fact you've done something 20 years doesn't mean it's right or wrong. You know, it's either right or it's wrong today, not yesterday.
Okay. Yes, that's fine. That's fine. We'll ask ASI when they come before us. What, may I ask, are there any incidents, accidents of note that your aircraft has experienced that you think should have influenced change that has not been implemented to make things safer?
Right, can you run that by me again, because that's a complex question.
It seems as if you have difficulty persuading the authorities to make change because of cost. That's what you keep saying, because of money. Things are not being done.
I don't think I actually said that with respect. You're joining two different statements together. First of all, the regulator has no interest in costs whatsoever. Either it's safe or it's not safe. They don't care how much it costs. So the regulator is not involved in any commercial decision whatsoever. They won't even listen to the argument.
I'm not referring to the regulator.
I used my statement when I was talking about the government of Montserrat possibly not investing or providing enough budget for John A. Osborne Airport. Again, that's up to John A. Osborne Airport management to fight their own battles, but I'm suggesting that it is underfunded.
So the question then is, are there any accidents that have taken place that have allowed you to make the point of what's needed that's not being provided?
Okay, so we, alongside every other airline that I know of, has a very robust safety management system. My good wife is in charge of ours here, and we actually run that very, very tightly, and it's the buzzword with any regulator: how is your safety management system? So any incident or accident, however small or however big, is documented, is investigated as part of that safety management system. We hope we learn from incidents and accidents. And every airline that I'm aware has incidents and accidents, minor possibly, on a fairly regular basis. They're documented on a hazard log, they're investigated, and we carry out investigation in what went wrong, and that is reported to the regulator. So we have a very robust safety management system. So the answer to your question is yes.
You said earlier that there were some risk assessment being conducted regarding...
We do risk assessments all the time. So, for example, when we were asked to carry COVID with dry ice, we had to run our own risk assessment, produced the results to the regulator, who said yes or no. They said yes, because we'd done a good risk assessment. I was making the comment to you in respect of night flying, if you recall,
Correct.
that we were asked, and I'm fairly confident the airport management would have been asked as well, to carry out a risk assessment and produce it for the regulator. We have done that, but as at the time of talking, I have not seen their response.
Have both airlines provided a risk assessment, SVG and Fly Montserrat?
I can't comment. I have no idea.
You have no idea. Okay. And is your risk assessment reviewed by the airport management?
Yes, the airport management would have to do an airport risk assessment where they have to start looking at broadly the same problems, which is obstructions that you can't see at night. As I say, we've got runway lights, but only 50% of them are working because presumably they can't afford to fix the problem. I hate coming back to money, but the airport is underfunded. So if we can actually fix the landing lights, that's that problem solved. But they're there, they just need fixing.
Do you share your risk assessment with the airport management so they can review your risk assessment?
We would share with them the ones that are relevant to airport operations, not to us personally.
The one for night flying?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So you've shared the risk assessment with the airport management?
Yeah. And they do the same with us. In terms of night flying and instrument approaches, we've also, or the airport, not me, have been talking to their colleagues in Anguilla that I think a year ago went through the process of getting approval for night flying and for instrument approach and succeeded. So rather than reinvent the wheel, I think that the airport management has been looking at what they did and getting some help maybe.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. Good.
We've heard about ASI as regulator. How does ASI relate to yourself as or operators in general? What's the relationship?
I can answer it. The relationship is very good and very open.
I'm sorry, I'll just ask it again. We heard about ASI, which is the regulator. Can you tell us or describe for us the relationship between ASI and yourselves as an operator or any other operator?
Okay, well, as I started off...
so that the public understands from
Sure.
the perspective between ASI as regulators and yourself as well as, well, ICAO, do I have that? ICAO?
ECA in Antigua,
ECA. Well,
Eastern Caribbean.
ECA as well,
ICAO is part of the United Nations.
And, yeah.
It's part of the UN, and it's an advisory body for airlines and operators, airports, anything to do with aviation all over the world. ICAO is not a regulator, but it comes up with what are called standards documents. And those standard documents set out best practice. So, for example, it would say best practice is you need to have approach RESA and departure RESA. It doesn't implement the law. It's then up to the regulator looking after that airport or airline to say, we will adopt that and it's now law.
Can I just step in? So they give you recommendations? Have we got that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, they give the regular recommendations, not the... Yeah.
Okay.
We deal... Our point of contact is ASI. They're our regulator, right? Our friends at SVG, their point of contact is ECA. That's their regulator. But those regulators, if they've got any sense, and I'm sure they have, they will listen to what ICAO is saying. And if ICAO say, listen, chaps, it's a good idea that you recategorize runway contamination into wet, damp, etc., because this, we think, is a better way of doing it, and in the interest of safety, then the regulator will accept it, may even embellish it. I mean, the British are very good at gold-plating rules, so they'll take a recommendation from ICAO, and they'll even tighten it up beyond what ICAO. They'll then say, now that is the law for Montserrat, for the airport, or for Fly Montserrat. We then have to accept that because it's now become the law. So our relationship with ASI is very good. We have what I would call a working relationship. They inspect us, they criticise us, which is good. You know, they slap our wrist if we're getting it wrong, and they help us. And in the same way, we copy them in on all our risk assessments. So the relationship is a working relationship.
Okay. Are you check pilot? Is that the correct term?
Yes.
Tell us what the duties are for check pilot?
Well, we have different sort of categories. That's a good question. We have training captains who will do all the ground studies, right, and examine on that basis. Okay. We have, for licensing purposes, we have check pilots who examine on a periodical basis, either 6 monthly, 12 monthly, or in the case of the FAA, 2 yearly. Because ASI doesn't issue licenses, they only issue validations. They don't control licenses. The licenses are controlled by the state of issuance. Now, previously, we've had pilots with all British licenses or EU licenses at the time that we were part of Europe for Brexit. Now, purely coincidentally, all our pilots have FAA, American licenses. So the Americans are responsible for their check pilots on their licensing checks. Then we have company checks, which is what we as a company have said, we want you to do all these checks for us. It's not necessarily the law, but that's what we require. Right? So we would do 6 monthly flying checks on them and refresher training on their ground. For that, we report back to ASI. But we also, on top of that, they also have what's called line training and line checks. So a guy joins us, he goes through all the training regime, and he gets to the point where I say this guy is now capable of flying the line, but under supervision of another pilot, another check pilot. And that takes as long as it takes. So where we brought people in on our apprenticeship scheme, that could be 6 months, could be 200-300 flights, because they're all short sectors. But at some point, it's going to get to the stage where we say, this guy is now totally safe, totally qualified. We go back to our insurers to make sure they're happy, and we sign him off in-house. But that, again, is checked by ASI to make sure we've done everything properly, of course. So the check pilot regime is several. It depends if it's a licensing check or a company. But pilots are used to being checked. I would say our guys get checked on something once a month. At least once a month, there is a check being carried out.
If a pilot from another jurisdiction wishes to fly in Montserrat, do they have to go through a check with you?
Okay,
Although they're licensed for their jurisdiction?
You're asking me complex questions. A pilot from another jurisdiction.
Keep it as simple as possible.
Okay, if he comes from a jurisdiction, first of all, he has to have his license assessed by ASI, not by us. I mean, I can guide him, because ASI have to validate his state of whatever. Basically, ASI will validate any ICAO state. So if you happen to be some, dare I say, dodgy state somewhere in the world that's not part of ICAO, we wouldn't validate it. But most of the major companies are part of the club, they're part of ICAO. So first of all, ASI have to say, we accept his license. Then the problem comes to us in Airline. You can't suddenly turn up from Miami and say, here's my license, I'm an experienced Islander pilot, can I fly tomorrow? Absolutely not, no more. Which is back to this notice period policy, that for us to recruit, train, and get online a pilot is probably 6 months. If I want another aeroplane, it's 6 months. I need a policy. Fly Montserrat needs a policy, because it's 6 months. That's too late for Christmas. I cannot get more pilots in time for Christmas. I still can for St. Patrick's, if someone will talk to us and tell us what they want. But there's a long lead time. So the answer to your question on licensing, no, you just can't turn up, even if you've got the right, you've got to go through the hoops of fire, I'm afraid. I hope you'd expect that answer, that these guys are, properly regulated and properly trained.
All right. Well, you've told us about the relationship with the government. How about the relationship with the governors or the governor's office?
Okay, so again, on paper, the governor is responsible for aviation on Montserrat. That's the airport and us. There's only one airline. She's got no jurisdiction over SVG, Winair at all. Right? She's only got jurisdiction over us as the VP on the side of the aeroplane. And for the airport, she has responsibility, including security. So on all the licenses that we get issued are all signed by the governor. But in practice, she cannot be an expert on aviation matters. I mean, we've touched on some fairly complex subjects here this morning. So she passes that responsibility to ASI. So ASI advised the governor. So if you want to fly in Montserrat, you have to go on the internet, and you can do it, and you look up governor's instructions for Montserrat. So the governor has given instructions on how people fly at Montserrat. Because we're a Cat C airport, which is the most challenging, we have special regulations. They come out in what's called the governor's instructions. She didn't write that. That came from ASI. It's purely over her name. But yes, it is her name, and she's signing it, so she's got the responsibility. But it's in a way the same. You were asking about law. What is law? If you pass a law in England, it only becomes law once the king signs it. Does the king understand everything he's signing? Okay. So the governor is responsible for all aviation matters, including security, but she delegates that to ASI.
Captain Harris, I'm going to ask a question. It's going to be a very strong question that has been knocked about in Montserrat. It is felt that flying Montserrat is given preferential treatment by the governor's office. How would you
I would say
see
it's
that?
the diametric opposite. I think we're giving the least priority, and that applies equally to the government of Montserrat. I am so disappointed that we don't support our local industries. We should be supporting Montserrat-based companies that employ local staff who put money into the economy over a foreign company. It's quite right. America that will only let its government employees fly on an American airline. You cannot fly on British Airways as an American government employee by law. Right? I would love to see the same in Montserrat, where so we get absolutely no priority from the governor. To the contrary, I think she gives us a harder time, particularly our governor at the moment.
When we had this resolution before the House, there was an email that was shared, and it said in the email that the then Premier was to assuage, the word assuage, A-S-S-U-A-G, assuage. Okay, yeah. That must be one of my first pronunciations I got.
I'd have had to look that one up.
Maybe I need to, I wouldn't say that word. What do you...
I can't comment what you're
You
talking
can't
about.
comment
It's
to
out of
that,
context.
so you haven't
so
seen the context.
No.
Indeed.
I haven't seen that word, so I'd have remembered it. So
Yes.
I've never seen what you're talking about.
Yes, okay. Well, Albert...
Go ahead.
And that's a fair response because it has to be placed in context.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Other members
May I
of
ask
the
a question?
committee may have.
Have you ever made the case against Twin Otters to the governor's
Absolutely not.
office? No.
It's a lovely airplane, British made, you know. Of course
I want to be sure you hear the question. Have you ever made the case against Twin Otters to the governor's office?
No.
You have not, in discussion with the governor's office, spoken...
If the governor were to ask me, and she hasn't because she's employed... let me answer your question. She has employed a consultant, an expert, to answer these questions. She has not asked me the question.
Forgive me, I'm not asking about the present governor. In the past 10, 15 years, have you made the case against the Twin Otter to the governor's office? Not this present governor.
Absolutely not. I'm not saying we haven't discussed Twin Otters alongside of Caravans, Zodiacs and a whole plethora of aircraft. Of course, the governor wants to be informed and know what's going on, and aircraft performance is not necessarily their subject, is it? So if they come to us, either in a social environment, whatever, and say, Nigel, what do you think about the Twin Otter? I would have given them the same answer as I've been giving you this morning, what the problems are. Right, and there are problems and advantages. I'm certainly not anti-Twin Otter. It's a very good airplane. If the government would like to fly Montserrat 2 Twin Otter -400s, we'll operate them tomorrow morning for you and be exceptionally happy operating Twin Otters. But what is wrong is that on just about every interview from everybody, you hear Twin Otters, as if it's the only aeroplane in the world. Please, please, let's talk about aircraft for the good of Montserrat and what is the best fit for an aircraft coming here. It might be a Twin Otter 400. I think it should be a Tecnam, or we've got Islanders at the moment. Let's broaden the conversation, but emphatically, no, Fly Montserrat is not anti-Twin Otters. We are pro-Twin Otter 400s.
Can I just add something to that? Back in the day, 2012, I think it was, we actually had an MOU with MDC, as it was then, in which they were going to invest in our company and facilitate the acquisition of a Twin Otter. They never came forward with the money, and it never happened. MDC was then dissolved. So government did have an interest, and we had an interest. You know, our shareholders were told right back at the beginning that we wanted the company to develop. And that would mean, in time, getting, you know, larger aircraft. But government at that time then decided not to go ahead with it. We'd like them to do so now. It doesn't have to be the Twin Otter 400, it could be the Tecnam, but it needs to be something up to date and capable of moving the market for the next 10 years or so.
I'll be frank. What airline do you think, or aircraft, not airline, aircraft would do that in your view?
Here, Tecnam.
Yes.
Well, you have to define the market. And I'd have to say, what is the catalyst for change on Montserrat? Shelly's given you a figure, I think, 24,000 movements, passenger movements. If you want a bigger aircraft, we need a bigger market, otherwise we lose money. I think that's fairly logical, right? So if you're going to produce me a bigger market, is that 24,000 going to 30,000, 40,000, 50,000? Over what period of time? But the main question is, what is the catalyst for change? Are we building a Hilton hotel with 400 rooms? All right. What's going to change on the infrastructure on the island? Are we going to get our electricity to work? Is my internet going to work all day, which it doesn't at the moment? Are the roads going to be improved? The hospital? I can go on, I won't bore you with it. But something has to change to get that market increased. So please give me a policy for 5 years and say, this is what we propose to do. We think that 24,000 is going to go up to 30,000 or whatever. I will then get you the equipment. You've got to tell me what the demand is. You tell me the demand, we'll supply. No problem.
Did you say that you made a proposal to MDC, or you and MDC had an agreement to go towards purchasing a Twin Otter?
It was not. It was more than a proposal. It was a signed MOU.
How long ago was that?
I think it was 2012.
And what aircraft were you going to purchase? Was it the
Twin Otter?
At that time, it was a Twin Otter. There was no Tecnam then. The Tecnam is a new aircraft.
So it wasn't the 400?
No.
There was no 400.
There was no.
So
it was probably just about the time there was.
So you were going to buy the aircraft that is now not permitted to land full load?
Yeah, but this
That's
was 11
years
years ago. This was 11. No,
I
sorry,
know.
more than that. 11
Things
years
change.
ago.
Of
Things
course.
change.
So what has changed?
RESA, wet runways, possibly Viking with moving style performance. ASI insisting that reverse thrust is not used on landing.
ASI.
All those have changed.
When was the RESA made a requirement?
It came in stages because there was departure and there was arrival. It didn't come at the same time. You'd have to ask the airport, but one of them was changed probably about 5 years ago, but please don't quote me on that, but that sort of stage. The other one was done by alternative means of compliance, which is acceptable to ASI. This is a paper, it's a theoretical exercise, you appreciate that, but it's important when you're calculating what you can bring into Montserrat.
So
I'm so sorry.
had you gotten the Twin Otter that you were seeking to get, you're saying now you'd have to change to a different aircraft?
Yes.
Based on the...
Yes. Yes.
But at the time you were convinced that it was appropriate?
At the time they built John A. Osborne Airport, they said it was a Twin Otter airport.
Okay. I do have another question, but go ahead.
Certainly. No, I was just asking for the document to give us an idea
Okay, please ask.
of the thinking process back then.
Go ahead.
The MOU, if we can have a copy of that, please, we'd be grateful.
Well, you said you participated in the consultations over the construction of a new airport many years ago, before 2005. Many were concerned then about the length of the airstrip that we would get. They were concerned that it was between two valleys, so it couldn't be expanded. They were concerned about the type of aircraft that would land, would limit our connection to other aircrafts, and the cost, the safety, all of these issues. What was your view then?
Okay, I mean, you have to remove me from the financial and political elements of this conversation, because, as we all know, clearly at the end of the day, it comes down to cost. That's nothing to do with what I was doing at all. We were purely looking at the operational side of an airport. So I'm quite happy to answer your questions on the operational side. We do, again, hear lots of rubbish on this island about why don't we extend the runway? Well, how are you going to do that? If you extend it towards Lookout, you actually make it worse, not better, because you're moving the obstruction closer to the aeroplane. If you follow me, you have to climb 110 foot from taking off at John A. Osborne to get over the palm trees and the houses at Lookout, right? So if you move the runway, extend the runway over the gut closer to Lookout, then you're actually making the problem worse, because the aeroplane has to outclimb on a steeper gradient. I don't explain that well enough. If you extend it at the other end, you're purely looking at costs. Can you do it? Yes, of course you can do it. But it's going to cost an absolute fortune to extend it back down towards the direction of arrows, if you know what I mean, going that way. So that could be done, but it's going to be expensive. But certainly don't do it at the other end, because it makes the problem worse. I am more concerned possibly not about the length of the runway, but the runoffs at either end. You touched on that earlier, and it's nothing to do with RESA. It's if you have an overrun, right, you've got a gut at the far end, and there have been real issues over the years with accessibility to that gut if there was an incident. Again, we should be looking at safety at our airport, and that involves making funds available to actually solve the problem.
My question was, what was your view and recommendation then, prior to the airport being built?
In the context of, was it angled in the best direction? Was the approach? But sorry, that's what I was asking.
You name it. What was your recommendation?
We went with that alignment. Bear in mind, I had consultants with us at that time. Correct. From Halcrow. It wasn't my decision. I was just giving them advice. So it was Halcrow's recommendation. You really need to come and talk to them. But that was cited at the point that you could get the longest runway, allowing for the topography of where you were, and the closest into prevailing winds, given the topography of where you are. So we were purely looking at that, and we were at Teddington in the UK, where you do wind trials. They have these enormous hangars, and we were reconstructing Lookout, reconstructing the airport, and doing. So it's a very technical advice I was giving them. It wasn't political.
Were you saying then, back then, that the Gerald's Airport was being placed in a suitable position in comparison to the other options?
No, I was never asked the question in comparison. That was a financial decision. That was outside.
Prior to the airport being built, you were not involved in looking at the other options? You only looked at one option?
We were looking at other potential sites in terms of turbulence, winds and sighting. It's purely technical.
And what was your recommendation then?
It depends on what size of runway you want.
Which was your preferred recommendation?
I didn't have one. I can't answer that.
Do you have any documentation of what you presented at that time?
God, no.
No.
As it's long time.
Somebody would have it, though.
Halcrow would.
Halcrow would have it. Thank you.
Talk to Mr. Hogan. He was.
Has your view?
Talk to Claude Hogan.
Okay. Has your view changed in any way since then?
Again, it's a political question. If you said to me...
Not politically, technically,
Technically, you can build an airport on about 3 other sites. So it will come down to cost. And that's a political decision, and I won't be drawn on that. I'm
not asking whether you recommended what was less costly, which was more ideal as a technical...
As an ideal, I'd like a 3,000-foot runway into wind.
No. I'm asking of the various options. What was your... Anyway, you don't seem to answer that.
Gerald's was the closest to the optimum potential. Building at Thatch Valley, you're going to be flying permanently with crosswinds. That in itself is not an issue, but it effectively lengthens the runway you require. You're back to performance again. If you have headwind, it reduces the required performance because you don't need so long a runway. But if you went where there was prevailing wind would give you a crosswind, you need a longer runway.
So does that mean that you were in favor of Gerald's over Old Corps because of that?
The question was never asked. I never had to give that opinion. I think that was purely a financial decision.
Purely financial. Thank you. That's important. Anything else? Actually, just one last question. I recall one of our constituents in Salem spoke about an incident in landing at Gerald's Airport on one of your flights, and he said it was obvious when they landed that the plane was not going to make it to the end. And they all screamed, "Go back up." And the pilot persisted to land the plane, and they went right to the end. Would such incidents be recorded? I don't want to take the word of a passenger. Would that be recorded?
As I was saying earlier, if there is something which is an incident or ultimately an accident, we raise either a safety occurrence report for the slightly minor ones or a mandatory occurrence report if it's more serious, right? Those reports go to everyone that was involved, including the regulator. If it's a serious event, then the air accident people from the UK come out and investigate it independently, if anything to do with me at all. So I'm not aware of the incident you're talking about, clearly. But on what you've described, I would suggest that was probably an SOR, a safety occurrence report. So that would have been investigated, recommendations made, training, whatever. So,
and would you be able to provide a list of such reports that have taken place?
You're into slightly dangerous ground here, insofar as what you might consider an incident, I as a pilot might consider a normal event during the day.
What you consider important, or what is considered important by ASI, can you provide those to the committee?
I'd have to check with ASI. I'm not sure that's confidential. We have confidentiality and freedom, whatever.
My last question on the matter.
But if you're going to do that, for a level playing field, I would insist you carried out the same exercise with SVG, who've also had fatal accidents, as you're aware, at least 2. So, providing you provide a level playing field and do it equally, and I'd want that to be demonstrated. We don't have any secrets, if you put it that way, but there is a confidentiality aspect here where we encourage all our pilots and all our staff to report everything, even if it's their fault. This is a no-fault safety culture. I wouldn't want to break that by identifying people who've, in the interest of safety, have made those reports.
And my last question on the issue of the length of the runway and what you've said so far. The RESA would require how much more if you wanted to add to the strip? How much more?
70 feet. Again, it's not
70 feet.
You need to talk to the airport manager.
I
believe it's 70 feet.
Would adding that additional space affect the lookout challenge you spoke about? Just 70 feet? 70 feet?
You've got your 600 metres, that's concrete, that's physical, okay? So we need, in our islanders at the moment, 400. The Technam needs less, not more, all right? So both those aircraft, taking off from the end of the runway, will be airborne within 400 feet. So, meters, 400 metres. So therefore the relevance of lookout is lost because that's what's happening there.
No, but the question is, wouldn't adding just a small amount required for the RESA be a threat?
No, because RESA, it's still concrete. It's purely a theoretical number.
I know, but
if you use performance calculations.
Okay.
It's not real.
It's
real for the calculation, but it's not real for the runway.
I leave that question for ASI and the others. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. You didn't have enough of your water. Thank you so much again for attending this hearing and for sharing your views and information, your expertise as well with us. And if any other question arises that we may want clarity on, we will come back to you. We'll also send to collect the MOU and any other documentation.
Sure. Absolutely no problem at all. I mean, it's a privilege to be here. Thank you very much for hearing what we had to say. I appreciate some of it. It's slightly controversial. We are part of the infrastructure on Montserrat. We've been here an awful long time. We are a successful business. I counted the other day 13 other airlines that started in Montserrat and all had failed. We've been here a long, long time. We're here to help people, to work with you guys for the good of Montserrat, but we need a policy, then we know what we're doing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mrs. Harris.
Panel, are we allowed to speak to Mr. Harris? Aviation.
Captain Burke, thank you very much for joining us. You have been very patient with us, been waiting. No, any questions that you may have as we are, when you're presenting your information, you can share those with us. And if the committee deems that it is necessary, we can recall the witnesses.
Okay, I thought they would be from other personnel.
Yeah, but you can share your concerns and we can follow those up and get responses if needs be. Yeah, so we are not at all averse to receiving concerns or questions that you may have heard throughout the hearing, which is starting today, and in any other session, we would welcome those, and that's for anyone, because as we say, we want to enhance access in Montserrat. That's what we want. So the questions, but we won't allow persons outside to question our witnesses.
So we can leave questions to them. You're saying?
Yes, you can share questions that you may wish with us, and we will determine the way forward.
During or after?
During, and we will take further submissions if there are any. For example, if you wish to share anything further, Captain Harris and Mrs. Harris may do so, and any other witness that we may call. We are not restricting. We are here to really ventilate the issues and come to a recommendation or recommendations that we can put before the Legislative Assembly for a way forward for access. Okay, so please share your concerns, your questions, any of those, and we will seek to find the answers. Thank you. Captain Burke?
And good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks again for your patience. You have been waiting with us, and we truly appreciate that. We would first seek to establish your professional expertise and what we base that on, and then we will hear from you. As you said, you may have questions and share with us on the issue of access here in Montserrat. So for the record, can you tell us your name?
Okay, good afternoon. Name is Carl. And Montserrat, born Annie Street, December 9th. I sent a page, Dr. Nigel. Still has it in her, but she can, she so desire. I'm hearing you. I didn't hear you.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Yes, I have before me the summary of your professional career. Do you wish me to read it into the evidence? Because we want our listeners to know about you.
I will be happy.
Carl Burke, airline captain for over 30 years in the airline industry. Captain Burke became an aviation enthusiast at the age of 5 and thereafter pursued his dream of becoming an airline pilot. He was born on the island of Montserrat, then migrated to Antigua in 1987 at age 18 to attend the Antigua State College A-Level department. He graduated in 1989 with a diploma in mathematics and geography, then worked as an apprentice land surveyor in his father's, Burke's business until September 1991. He then enrolled in the commercial pilot training program at the Moncton Flight College located in Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada. After graduating from Moncton Flight College in 1992 with a Canadian commercial license and multi-engine and instrument ratings, Captain Carl Burke returned to Antigua in September 1992 and completed the Eastern Caribbean Civil Aviation Authority professional pilot conversion examinations by December 1992. In April 1993, Captain Carl Burke traveled to Guyana in search of employment and commenced co-pilot training with Air Services Limited. This training entailed a minimum 500 hours interior jungle flying and the successful completion of Guyana Air Law Performance, aircraft and loading examinations, which were all mandatory to obtain the Guyana license. After completing 800 plus hours of interior jungle flying, he acquired his Guyana commercial license in July 1994. Shortly thereafter, Captain Carl Burke was invited by Late 1974 Limited to attend a 2-week D8C-6 de Havilland Twin Otter ground school and direct entry co-pilot assessment. Captain Carl Burke was employed by Late 1974 Limited on the 29th of July 1994 and served as Twin Otter co-pilot, Dash 8 co-pilot, Dash 8 captain, and ATR 42/72 600 series captain during his 26.5 years tenure at Late. During this time, he was able to advance his studies in various sectors of aviation and air transportation in general by attaining accreditations in IATA, transportation of dangerous goods, safety systems management, cockpit resource management, and first aid. He was also involved in the industrial relations between the company and its pilots, which gave him exposure to flight operations management, flight scheduling, crew rostering, and the air regulations of over 10 jurisdictions throughout the Americas. It is important to highlight that in 1997, Captain Carl Burke acquired the FAA Airline Transport Pilot's License after completing studies and flight training at American Flyers and all ATPS in Florida, USA. He recently returned to Antigua from England, where he commenced the process of converting his Antigua and Barbuda ATPL to UK Civil Aviation ATPL. It is anticipated that this conversion would be completed by November 2023. And again, we welcome Captain Burke to this, our inquiry.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Just wanted to highlight performance studies that Harris referred to, the same performance which I did in back in 19 Britain, TAA office in invigilated UKCA. So performance criteria then was done on the Lockheed L-1011 aircraft considered to be a Performance A aircraft. I'm not too sure if everybody's hearing me. I see you leaning forward. Are you hearing me clearly?
It's better when you just asked the question.
Okay. Okay. Hint me whenever. Now, I sat and I listened to Captain Harris, and I'm sure that all Montserratians could agree that the reason for us having this forum obviously is to improve airlift into Montserrat. And over the last few weeks, I thought about the goals and objectives of this meeting. And I want to thank the Legislative Council for using their initiative to put together such a forum so that you can have input from not only the public, but from aviators such as Captain Vernon Anthony Meade, who is here on the Zoom, that we can listen to what has been happening in Montserrat, and we can sort of make recommendations in the direction in which we should go. I heard some figures being thrown out in terms of numbers coming into Montserrat for airlift, etc. And I believe that we need, there is an opportunity for us to increase airlift capacity into Montserrat. And I don't believe that we are going to be able to do it by using 9-seater aircraft. We have restrictions in terms of the topography of the island. And we have an airport, which we are using right now, which can accept larger aircraft. And I must say I'm in agreement with Captain Harris in terms of the Twin Otter 400 aircraft, which we should be focusing on. We have to decide which route we're going to take or which way we're going to go in order to have the largest aircraft that we can possibly handle in that airport. I do believe we can establish a relationship with Pike, who is not a manufacturer. I believe that they have expertise to help us. Can do all the which can be verified by ASI, also the ECA, ECCAA in Antigua. It's very important that we proceed with caution because aviation, as Ms. Captain Harris pointed out, is a very expensive business. And at this point in time, I would recommend that the government needs to, first of all, decide if they're going to wet lease an aircraft coming in from a Twin Otter 400 operator, whether they're going to be investing into Fly Montserrat, or whether the government is going to be going to operate the airline on its own. I can say to you, there's been mention of the Tecnam aircraft. That is an aircraft made in Italy. Based on what I have seen on the company's website, the aircraft sits 9 passengers. I noticed he mentioned 11. The aircraft sits 9 passengers. We will be going from one piston engine aircraft to a more modern piston aircraft, and we will still have the same logistical problems of getting the numbers into Montserrat. Increase airlift into Montserrat is better for the economy. We have the right route structure in place with our trading partners. It will improve our tourism product and provide additional seating for day tour operators, etc. We have to be very careful how we go forward with this exercise. The reason why I recommended a wet lease arrangement initially, it will give the government a chance to assess the aircraft performance on the routes, mainly Montserrat, Antigua. You will have all the data from the wet lease operator in terms of the fuel burns, the maintenance costs, the repetitive maintenance that has to be done, etc. Also, a wet lease arrangement is only needed to increase the capacity, I would say, 5 to 6 months out of the year. It would be around the peak season of St. Patrick's, if we were to start there, maybe St. Patrick's to Easter. Another peak 2 months in the summer, I would say July, August. And of course, December, January. We can say November 15th to December 15th to January 15th, those 2 months. That way, you would not have an aircraft that you own or the government has owned that will have to maintain all year round. So a wet lease arrangement, I never heard Captain Harris mention that, but it's a good way to put your feet in the water, to test things out, to see how the aircraft performs. Now, a very interesting question came up, and a very interesting scenario referenced an agreement between the Montserrat Development Corporation and Fly Montserrat, which I would have liked to get some more clarity on from Captain Harris, but of course he's not here with us. And one of those questions is, what is he couldn't clearly state as to the percentage shareholding which Montserrat Development Corporation has in Fly Montserrat at this time. I don't know if their shares are being diluted to the point where they're not a significant partner, but it would be interesting to know if he's asked the panel twice that if the government would give 2 twin otters to Fly Montserrat, that he would welcome that. Now, the investment of these 2 twin otters, would Mr. Harris, if that investment took the government into a majority shareholding position, which is a 51% or greater, if he would accept that sort of arrangement? This is one of the questions which he should have answered. He never really indicated that. I would say to you that with the Tecnam aircraft, I've not seen anything on their website reference financing. On the Viking website, the financing is available through CDB, Canadian Development Bank, and it could be done government to government. Not too sure if the Montserrat government will be able to go directly to the Canadian government or if this has to be done through the UK government. I leave that to the politicians. But financing is very important. As I said, it's a decision which Montserrat government has to make, whether they're going to be doing a wet lease arrangement or whether the government is going to be looking to purchase an aircraft. Purchasing an aircraft, you have to start thinking about crew training. You have to start thinking about the hangar for the aircraft, which Mr. Captain Harris mentioned, which I think is very important. The hangar would have to be built in Montserrat, not only for maintenance purposes, to protect the aircraft from the sea blast, and also we know that our atmosphere in Montserrat will have some sulfur content in it. These are things which have to be considered. The maintenance schedule, training, recurrent training of the crew. Fly Montserrat does a lot of training on the aircraft. In modern times, you want to do simulator training. And this would help in getting the airline certified in terms of what he recommended, which is GPS approaches. And I didn't get a chance to ask him if his pilots are what we call RNAV approved, because are the airplanes, I don't think the Islanders are certified. Captain Meade could probably back me up on this. The Islander aircraft as it is not certified for RNAV approaches. And I'm not certain whether Fly Montserrat operates on what we call instrument flight rules or whether they operate for flight rules.
Pardon me? Could you please repeat what you just said and clarify it for us, please?
Okay. When an aircraft files a flight plan from Antigua to Montserrat, can they operate in the weather when it's called instrument meteorological conditions, which means the weather is down to, let us say, a mile, and clouds below 1,000 feet. Approaches are governed by visibility. Are his pilots certified to fly in those conditions? Or are they only certified to fly in VFR conditions, which is visual flight rules? That's one of the questions which we need to ask. He is the head trainer, and he said that there are several things he said which would improve or the operation in and out of Montserrat. And I'm dealing with GPS. He mentioned GPS approach into Montserrat. GPS approach is also what you can consider an RNAV approach. And the pilots have to be trained for these approaches, and the airplanes have to be certified to do these approaches. The ATR aircraft is certified for RNAV approaches. Dash 8 aircraft is certified for RNAV approaches. The Twin Otter is certified for RNAV approaches. I'm not certain if the islanders owned by Fly Montserrat, if they're certified for RNAV approaches, or if they just have a GPS system in them which they can use for navigation or to aid them in navigating. So it's technical, and it's something that has to be looked at, because he made a request and I didn't get a chance to ask him if his pilots, that instrument approach requires additional training every 6 months. He made a request for night landings, and he spoke about a McDonald report in 2014, if I understand. That's almost 10 years ago. That report, in my opinion, my humble opinion, would be considered invalid. You can look at it, you can see what was going on then, but the night certification should be done in conjunction with the ECCAA. They're right there in Antigua. Get them to say what you need to get the airport certified for night. I don't see how ASI can go against recommendations for a small island state with the restrictions that Montserrat has. It is very important that this is done with the ECCA. They will tell you in terms of the lighting and all of that. A report done 10 years ago may not take into consideration things that have recently been built in the aircraft in proximity of the aircraft flight path, and that could be buildings, that could be cell phone towers, etc. Very important that we get a fresh study done and a new report done, and recommendations should come in. And of course, we need to know how they're going to be funded. In today's date of solar power and all of that, they can put the lights, solar powered lights on Silver Hills. They can put them wherever they need to put them. All right? I think that any obstruction above the aerodrome within 5 miles has to be lit. And that would be in terms of antennas, etc. If you have an antenna at the police station in or something like that, this is how it goes. First study has. We also made about fuel. I mean, you have Delta. Montserrat. You can ask them. Would it be cost to you it's aviation 100 low-lead fuel in Montserrat? It would be in the best interest for the government to have a fuel provider such as Delta to do that. Delta may say to you, based on the statistics we've gathered from Rubis in Antigua, or based on looking at Fly Montserrat's consumption, it's not economically viable for us to do that. This is something the government has to also watch. You don't want to start stocking aviation fuel. Aviation fuel is audited. I believe, in my recollection, every quarter, the expert has to go take samples of the fuel you have stored and send it away for testing to make sure that the fuel is not degrading and that it's not unfit for consumption by the engines. If they find that the fuel has been degraded, you have to discard all that fuel. You don't want the government to get into that. All right. The possibility of having a Bowser that can be transported by your cargo ship from Antigua to Montserrat is something you can look at. That way you don't have to stockpile lots of fuel. You do have these Bowsers that a rig can put onto a container ship. Whether you're buying the fuel in Puerto Rico or you're getting it cheap from Venezuela or whatever, you have Bowsers that can be moved that way. And maybe one Bowser every month would be enough to supply the needs of Fly Montserrat. All right. So quite a few requests were made, quite a few figures were thrown out. There was mention of $4,500 part. Now, he never mentioned whether it's a part that they had to change every 10,000 hours or whether he only changed that part once in the last 20 years. This is not how we work out cost in aviation. So we have to be careful when people start throwing figures at you. And, you know, scare tactic.
Yes.
That's what came to mind. Well, the couple, which is why prompted me to ask
Captain Harris.
Burke.
Sorry, Captain Burke. Thank you for sharing about what we appreciate you sharing on what you've heard, but we also want to hear from you, from your own experience, a very experienced pilot. And we've had discussion on the Twin Otter. We have discussion on RESA. We want to hear from you on our RESA requirements that have been implemented in Montserrat, as well as the length of our airport from yourself as an experienced pilot, and how these issues affect access into Montserrat, and what, if any, recommendations or suggestions that you may have in relation to these issues, which are very technical issues. So we wish to hear from you on perhaps we can start with the airport itself and the runway, addressing the issue of RESA, and then we can move on to, in coming out of that, perhaps we can tie two in one in addressing the aircraft. You have shared already your views on some of the aircrafts, but we are looking to see what information we can garner to put all of these ideas, I said that all ideas contend, that we can make a recommendation in our report.
The research is all covered in the regulations, and the regulations which are published.
Captain Burke, we will be asking you questions as well. I know that you're looking at us and can see us, so we will perhaps raise our hand when we need to indicate to you that we want to ask a question or to clarify.
No, the regulations give the governor a lot of latitude and power to basically give what we call a deviation on any restriction which may come up. And the governor will be doing this in the interest of the people of Montserrat. And as I mentioned, because we have restrictions which are imposed upon us by a topography, this is a matter which can be handled in that way. I'm not too sure who is advising the governor. I have not seen any reports written to the governor. But what I can say, and what this committee can do, is we are looking at phenomenon. And we Captain Harris alluded to the fact that the Twin Otter 400 series can go in and out of Montserrat unrestricted. Whereas Win Air that flies the 300 series in and out of Sabre Airport, which is, Sabre is 1,312 feet long, 400 meters. They operate on a weight restriction in and out of Sabre. They do take the 19 passengers in and out. However, there are baggage restrictions in and out of Sabre. We can look at their operation. We can see what provisions they have in place, and we can ask our governor if they will be willing to review this with ASI and offer a deviation if necessary. I believe that the approach that was used with Winair, and I think they didn't respond for a particular reason, was a hostile approach, and we need to have a more transparent and bipartisan approach. Winair is operating in a Dutch territory, which is under the EASA. And as you know, since Brexit, the UK CAA has moved away from EASA. And there's been some friction. I mentioned to you that I'm doing a conversion in the UK right now of my license. And the UK will stipulate one thing outside of EASA. And it is causing a lot of tension. I say that to you to say that this is something that has to be approached with a lot of technical persons involved. And in my opinion, Captain Harris should not be advising. I've heard him say that he advised some parties, etc. He's the owner of an airline that's in conflict of interest. We have to be careful of that. We need to do an independent study. As I said, you can look at the Twin Otter 300, and I'm just saying that because you want to look at something that could bring the capacity into Montserrat. You want to look at he said Tecnam. I've said to the committee, Tecnam only takes 9 passengers. He said 11. I don't think at this point in time we need to be looking at reduced capacity. We can look at the 400, the Twin Otter 400, and he himself, and I have looked at the performance figures, the 400 is unrestricted into Montserrat. Landing and takeoff, even with the RISA. So we have to decide what we are going to do. I recommend a more independent approach, and the findings be presented to ASI, ECA, and if there are any restrictions, then the governor needs to be approached to see if there can be accommodation to offer a deviation. That is my recommendation. And she is covered under the regulations to do so. There's a section of the regulations which she can even ask for test flights or trial flights. And this is in part 3. All right, section 25 of the regulations. There is a way to do this. I wanted to be devil's advocate today to ask the owners of Fly Montserrat that he mentioned the fact that the runway is deteriorating and getting less restrictive. So I'm wondering if one day, for some unforeseen reason, we had some earth movement or something, and the runway came to 395 meters. He said he only needs 400 meters. If he will be seeking a deviation. Because when you explain that the aircraft needs 400 meters, you're talking about accelerate stop distance. You're talking about takeoff run available. Would you be seeking a deviation if the runway became less than 400 meters? And that is a question should be posed to him. A deviation would be offered, and it may say, well, okay, you can only take off with 6 passengers, or you can only take off with 5 passengers, or they will give a specified weight. And this is how it's done in aviation. You just don't say scrap the aircraft or discard the airport. So we need to look at whether or not the aircraft of choice requires a deviation. And that is all I would say in reference to the RISA. I know there are other persons who want to speak, such as Desmond Meade and Captain Tony Meade. So that is my advice to you with respect to the RISA. I've spoken on everything else. The Tecnam aircraft you're going to have an issue even getting a stretcher into that aircraft. I've looked at it. I've looked at the dimensions of the doors. The twin otter, you know, the air stair door comes down. There's a large cargo door that opens beside that, can actually hold at least 2 stretchers in it. It has the capacity for you to do cargo. If you're looking to grow your economy, you're looking to make advances in aviation, cargo is going to be something that is going to come into play. We have an issue with moving caskets and all of that sort of thing. When Lee had purchased the ATR, they found out that they couldn't move caskets in the ATR anymore because it didn't have the large cargo space like a Dash 8. These are things that have to be taken into consideration when you're purchasing aircraft. You talk about, if you purchase an aircraft, you have to think about resale value. Suppose 3-4 years into the project, you realize it is costing the government too much. You don't want to be stuck with 2 Tecnam aircraft sitting on the ground in Montserrat. So there's a lot that has to be done. I'm just saying, do a proper feasibility study. Make sure that you cross your T's, dot your I's. Use independent persons who are not attached to any airline. And we can chart the way forward from there. That is my recommendation.
I need to ask a quick question.
Sure.
2 quick questions, Mr. Burke. One is, were you consulted or interviewed by the consultant that's doing the study into finding the appropriate aircraft for Montserrat?
No, I wasn't.
Did you hear that?
No, I was not.
You were not consulted. You also made a very strong statement by saying that the governor or the ASI took a hostile approach towards addressing the twin otter service to Montserrat. I'd like you to explain why, apart from the fact that you think that that ASI can take the same approach as the Dutch are doing in Sabre. Why do you say the approach was hostile? What was done that was hostile?
I read the correspondence and the timeline, given to the operator to respond, I think was unrealistic. And in my opinion, it was a closed door. Sort of, if someone gives you a task that you know you can't complete, they're not really negotiating in good faith. They're not, giving you an opportunity to present their case. And as I said, you have restrictions on your island. You're handicapped. You want to see the best way in which you can increase your airlift into Montserrat. You don't want a stack of restrictions on the operators. It is defeating the purpose. Right? So you could have asked Winier to produce their figures in a reasonable time. They were operating in there. And the reason why I believe that they did not respond is you're trying to tell me that I'm operating a fly-by-night operation if you tell me to produce my figures, because I have been operating in there. I am certified by my Civil Aviation Authority. I have produced the figures to my Civil Aviation Authority. You should then contact the airline or the Civil Aviation Authority in the Dutch Antilles and ask them to share the performance data for the twin otter into Montserrat. These performance figures are generated by computers these days. They could have simply given them some time to produce their performance charts, which are on board the aircraft. They would have performance charts there for Montserrat. You simply go into the tables, you look at your rotation speeds, the maximum weights, and all of that you can depart with on a particular day based on the atmospheric conditions. The airlines don't operate by guesswork. So a captain operating out of Montserrat on the day when the winds are calm, 31 degrees, himself and the co-pilot, prior to departure, they would look into the manuals and they would pull the figures and they pass that information on to the traffic agents in the airport terminal and said, look, we can go unrestricted, or based on the current conditions, we can only take off with, whether it be 12,500 pounds or whatever the case might be. This is how it's done. So if an island has been in and out of Montserrat for 20 years, as it is, you just don't want the action to produce your thing, or else.
Okay.
You have to
My last question to you is, of the two aircrafts, the Twin Otter and the Islander, which, in your view, professionally and technically, is more appropriate for Montserrat?
I think it's Twin Otter.
And why do you say that?
Islander has its capabilities. It cannot mean that of the Islander breaking in the incident runway. It's an inferior breaking.
You hear that? It was breaking up.
Islander. It's an aircraft incident. It's a government obstacle. Not even manufactured. Islander is inferior compared to the Twin Otter has reverse thrust. So whether the runway is wet or not, once the pilot selects reverse thrust, the aircraft can be stopped. And Captain Harris mentioned that, oh, who said it's going to work? There are stipulations. You test before every flight. How do you know your brakes are going to work? You test them before you take off. If it so happens when you get to the next destination, they have failed. The fact is you have tested them and there are redundancies built into the system. So there's no need to say your performance is based on reverse thrusters working. Montserrat can stipulate in their certificate, reverse thrusters must be working, tested prior to each flight. Auto feather system must be working, functional prior to each flight. And they do these tests. Pilots do these tests. They know the system is working. As the captain is taxiing out, he checks the reverse thrusters. That is just elementary. So what I'm saying, there's certain things that were said that to a non-aviation person, it may seem risky. But in aviation, we manage risk. This is what safety management systems is about. We're always surrounded by elements of risk, but it's how you manage them. And this is what we need to do. We need to come together, get persons who are familiar with what is going on in the world of aviation, persons who have flown high-performance aircraft, who have flown Twin Otters, who have flown Islanders, and we can come up with the right recommendations to the government. And also we can approach the governor from an informed position. And this is what we need to do.
Captain Burke, are you familiar with Montserrat's RISA?
Yes, I'm familiar with airfield data right here.
Flown on our airstrip?
I have never flown as crew member. Only as a passenger.
A passenger. What is your understanding of a RISA? Runway and safety area.
If the pilot has to abort a takeoff, or if there's it is an area which he has to consider not within his takeoff run. So it's there more or less as part of the stopway. Right? So you base your performance for takeoff on the runway less the RISA.
In terms of...
Is that clear enough?
Yes. Can you, in your experience, in terms of Montserrat RISA, are you familiar with the construction of RISAs around the world or through your experience?
No, I am not. But as I said in my bio, I operated into a lot of rural strips in Guyana. Some made from just mere logs and wood, even shorter than Montserrat. And some of those airstrips, Twin Otter operated in there. As I mentioned to you, Sabre is a hard strip, and it is 400 meters. It is shorter than Montserrat, and yet they operate in there. And the reason why the operation is certified because it's in the interest of the people to get airlift in and out of there. And that's the point I'm trying to make. We don't want to get bogged down into looking at performance figures and trying to be debating the topic about the RISA and the shortness of the runway, etc. We have a runway, we have to utilize it. We have to utilize it to the best of our ability. And as I said, if for some unfortunate reason we were to end up with less runway than we have now, what are we going to do? Are we going to just shut down the airport? We're going to seek to have a deviation to have us use the runway that we have. And this is the point I'm trying to make. We have a restriction based on our topography. There is no new airport in sight. A new airport is going to cost the British government $200 million minimum. What do? We try to make the best of what we have.
Ms. Greenaway will ask some questions.
Good day, Captain Burke. Now, the line of questioning that we're pursuing, and we do recognize we do have to use what we have, which is why we're asking questions about the RISA and seeking to garner your views based on your technical knowledge of the subject area. So when we're asking about the RISA and what you understand the RISA to be, our line of questioning is with a view to getting to a point where you're able to advise us as to whether, bearing in mind what Montserrat RISA is, the material that Montserrat RISA is constructed with, whether your view is that this is still a, what a term, normal, usable part of the runway in everyday operations. Hopefully, being clear.
From what I have seen, I would say yes. I am not a civil engineer, and as I said, we can do a comprehensive look at the runway in terms of load bearing capacity and all that sort of thing, and we can see if it is able to support the maximum weight of an aircraft, 12,500, which is the category for the twin otter. And we can restrict the runway to that weight. In other words, yes, you might be able to land a Hercules aircraft in there, but you say, no, the Hercules is too heavy for that runway. We need to decide whether or not the runway can support the weight of a twin otter in an emergency at both ends of the runway. And that is what needs to be done. And I'm not too certain if that was done.
So you're unable to say
I'm
whether...
only hearing now from Captain Harris that we are now down to 600 meters of runway. So who determined that?
Sorry, for clarification, it's less than, if we're talking about factoring an area being recognized as RISA, I think we're down to, 30 meters on each side. We're down from 600.
No, he said today in a statement that the runway is deteriorating, the end of the runway is deteriorating, and it's actually less than what is published. And I was surprised to hear that from an airman. I'm not too sure if you heard the same thing. These are some of the questions where is he getting his data from? Who is saying that 600?
Sorry, Captain Burke, just for clarity, and because we want the record to reflect accurate information. I know we have recordings of Captain Harris, Captain Harris's evidence. I think what he said was that yes, he spoke of the airstrip being 600, the islander needing 400, and we know that it's 30 meters reduced on both sides. So he did address what was remaining after the RISA. So he did mention those three various sizes of the runway.
I heard statements being made about the length of the runway. Okay?
It is for us to determine, but from what we heard, he spoke, and we're not going to debate it, but we do not want the witness's statement to be misrepresented at all.
I have here, and I'm looking at your AIP, that I'm looking at the information on Montserrat's runway.
We'll clarify that in our notes, and we will come back to that. Right? We are not here to debate what each other has said, but we will clarify, and if needs be, we will recall Captain Harris to clarify for us. So we will move on.
Okay, no problem.
Captain Burke, just a few more questions on your, well, we're seeking your technical guidance and your opinion. You spoke on wet lease agreements, I think in respect of the Twin Otter 400?
Yes.
Just as background information, have you had the opportunity to fly one of those Twin Otters?
I never flew the 400 Twin Otter, but I flew the earlier series which Liat had.
Okay, thank you. But presumably you have done research into the Twin Otter 400, correct?
Yes.
What are your views in terms of its landing and takeoff capability in Montserrat? I know the discussions this morning, or the evidence this morning, has focused around that being the better Twin Otter. So what are your views in respect to that?
Well, based on the performance figures which I saw, and as Captain Harris did say, it is one of the aircraft presently available that can operate in and out of Montserrat unrestricted at max takeoff weight.
I'm sorry, unrestricted in relation to?
It is not weight. It is not weight. And take off at its maximum takeoff weight in and land and in Montserrat.
Yes, Captain Harris, just
I will yield to someone else, maybe Captain Meade, if you have no more questions.
Captain Burke, I know you previously spoke on airlift capacity, and I'm hoping this question has not been asked previously, but do you think that the limitation of number of passengers into Montserrat is a result of that?
Yes, I do believe so. I believe that if you're thinking about growing your economy, you're going to have to think of ways in which to increase airlift into Montserrat, not only from the standpoint of promoting tourism on the island. As you know, there's some folks out there who have desires of visiting some nature islands like Montserrat. We had a gentleman that ran a very interesting documentary on Montserrat called The Buried City a few months ago, which I watched while I was in the UK, and that did spark some interest. And I do believe that there is a potential for increasing trade with your neighboring partners, whether it be Antigua, Saint Martin, even the French islands. It's not gonna happen if you have limited capacity in terms of airlift. I know you have the ferry coming on shortly, but the ferry operation, we have situations where you might need airlift in terms of perishables. There's sometimes when you have the groundswell situation, especially in December, January, I believe, there are instances of medevac, etc. In and out of Montserrat. I think airlift is important. You cannot sometimes place a price tag on the value of having airlift. I've seen it so many times in the aftermath of hurricanes, where I've done a lot of those mercy flights into places like Dominica and Tortola and so on, getting vital supplies in and out of the island. If Montserrat is caught in a situation we had, like say for instance after Hurricane Hugo, where we lost the entire port, I mean this would tell you need to have that backup. Proper feasibility study needs to be done to tell the government how much this is going to cost them every year, whether by wet lease, whether by an investment in Fly Montserrat, which I have nothing against, or whether they want to have establish an airline on their own. I think it should be done. Because, as I said, it's an invaluable resource. You cannot downplay it. As you see right now, a lot of persons don't travel by sea because they have their fears of that. I forgot to mention that.
Thank you, Mr. Burke.
Before you leave us, with whom are you currently employed?
I'm not employed at the moment. I'm currently pursuing some studies. I travel off to do some simulator training in another week or so to complete. Well, once I've completed that that training, I would then be completing my application to the UKCA.
Okay. Any further questions for Captain?
No, thank you.
Ms. Greenway? Captain Burke, we want to thank you very much for joining us and for offering to share your expertise and your views with us. As we said, if we need to clarify anything or we wish to have any documentation from you, we reserve the right to recall you. And thank you especially for being on the online waiting to be heard and to share with us today. Thanks again for your interest.
You're welcome, and for inviting me, and I am available to answer your questions or to make any contribution to the future improvement of aviation, civil aviation in and out of Montserrat. That is my solemn obligation to my nation. Thank you.
Thanks again. For our audiences who are waiting, we again crave your indulgence, but the committee needs to have lunch, so we will adjourn until 2:45. We will take the adjournment until 2:45, and that would be followed by Mr. Desmond Meade.